You've been lied to about peace. They told you it comes from punishment, from being harder on yourself, from replaying your mistakes until they finally hurt enough. But if that were true, why does peace disappear the more you blame yourself? Why does the mind grow louder instead of calmer? Why does guilt remain even after you've learned and changed? The truth is simple and uncomfortable. You cannot punish yourself into becoming peaceful. Pain does not create clarity. Self-attack does not create wisdom. For centuries, Buddhist teachings have pointed to this misunderstanding. A mind that clings to guilt and judges itself endlessly is not becoming pure or disciplined. It is becoming trapped. Peace is not a reward for suffering. It is what naturally appears when the inner fighting stops, when you stop using pain as proof of growth and control as a substitute for understanding. The moment you stop turning against yourself, something begins to loosen. Tonight, as you listen, the pressure inside will begin to ease. The harsh inner voice will soften, your breath will slow, your thoughts will settle, and space will open where shame once lived. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped resisting yourself. This is not about excusing the past. It is about releasing it so it no longer owns your present. This is not weakness. This is the end of inner violence. You cannot punish yourself into becoming peaceful, but you can learn to let go, forgive, and finally rest. Are you ready? Let's begin. The moment the noise inside begins to quiet, something else often rushes in to replace it. Not peace, not relief, but a new demand. A whisper that says, now fix yourself, now do better, now don't mess this up. This is where many people unknowingly step out of understanding and back into struggle. What follows sounds like growth, looks like discipline, and feels like responsibility. But underneath it, something far more painful is taking place. Self-correction is usually praised. It is framed as maturity, strength, and wisdom. From a young age, we are taught that improvement comes from pressure, that mistakes must be met with force, that if something hurts, it must be working. Over time, this belief becomes automatic. Every flaw triggers an internal response. Every error demands immediate fixing. Every uncomfortable feeling becomes a problem to eliminate. At first, this seems helpful. You feel active, you feel in control, you feel like you're taking life seriously, but slowly, almost invisibly, self-correction turns into self-surveillance, and self-surveillance turns into quiet harm. The violence here is subtle because it does not shout. It does not insult you outright. It speaks in polite language. It says, you should be better by now. It says, don't relax yet. It says, once you improve this part of yourself, then you can rest. This voice rarely sounds cruel. It sounds reasonable. That is what makes it dangerous. You begin to live in a constant state of inner tension, always adjusting, always monitoring, always pushing. Life becomes a project instead of an experience. The present moment becomes something to correct rather than something to live inside. Buddhist teaching notices this pattern with great precision. It does not reject growth, learning, or discipline. What it rejects is aggression toward the mind. In Buddhism, wisdom does not come from forcing the mind into shape. It comes from seeing clearly. And seeing clearly requires gentleness. A mind under attack cannot see. A mind under pressure narrows. When you are constantly correcting yourself, you are not listening, you are commanding. And the mind, when commanded, resists in ways you may not consciously notice. One of those ways is exhaustion. Not the physical kind, but the deep tiredness that comes from never being allowed to be enough in the moment. You wake up already behind. You move through the day with an invisible checklist running in the background. You fall asleep reviewing what you should have done differently. Even rest becomes strategic. Even calm becomes something to achieve correctly. This is not peace. This is control disguised as care. The Buddha taught that suffering arises not only from obvious pain, but from clinging. Self-correction becomes violent when it clings to an image of who you think you must become. There is a future version of you that feels cleaner, calmer, more worthy, and the present you is treated like an obstacle in the way. When that happens, improvement is no longer guided by understanding. It is driven by rejection. You are not growing towards something. You are running away from yourself. This creates an internal split. One part of you becomes the judge. Another part becomes the problem. The judge watches closely, waiting for mistakes. The problem feels tense, guarded, and never safe. Over time, this inner relationship becomes strained. You may notice that even when you succeed, the satisfaction is brief. The judge immediately finds something else to fix. The finish line keeps moving. This is because the goal was never growth. The goal was relief from self-dislike. And that relief never lasts when the method is pressure. Buddhism draws a clear line between wisdom and self-attack. Wisdom observes without hatred. It notices patterns without turning them into identity. It allows mistakes to be teachers rather than verdicts. Self-attack, on the other hand, turns every misstep into proof. Proof that you are flawed. Proof that you are behind. Proof that you must try harder. The difference between the two is not subtle on the inside. One feels open, even when it is honest. The other feels tight, even when it claims to help. A key insight here is that awareness itself is corrective without being violent. When you truly see a habit clearly, change begins naturally. There is no need for punishment. Fire does not need to be angry at itself to stop burning your hand. The hand pulls away because it understands. In the same way, when the mind understands suffering, it loosens its grip. But understanding cannot happen in an atmosphere of fear. If the mind expects attack every time something is seen, it will hide, it will justify, it will resist. This is why harsh self-improvement often leads to repeating the same patterns rather than ending them. Many people believe they are being disciplined when they are actually being afraid. Afraid that if they stop correcting themselves, everything will fall apart. Afraid that compassion will make them lazy. Afraid that without pressure, they will lose direction. Buddhism challenges this fear directly. It teaches that clarity is stronger than force, that kindness toward the mind creates stability, not weakness, that a calm mind sees consequences more clearly than a stressed one ever could. When self-correction becomes violent, it also disconnects you from life. You are rarely where you are. You are in evaluation mode, talking to someone while adjusting yourself, eating while thinking about how you should eat better, resting while judging how you rest. This constant inner commentary drains joy from ordinary moments. Nothing is neutral. Everything is material for improvement. Even happiness becomes suspicious, something that must be justified or earned. The Buddha described this as restlessness, a state where the mind cannot settle because it is always reaching or rejecting. Relentless self-improvement feeds this restlessness. It tells the mind that stillness is unsafe. That pause means stagnation, that you must always be doing something to deserve being here. Over time, this belief becomes painful. You may feel anxious when nothing is wrong. You may feel guilty when you relax. You may feel uneasy when things are calm. This is the cost of confusing wisdom with pressure. True wisdom does not rush. It has patience. It understands that change rooted in fear collapses under stress, while change rooted in clarity holds steady. When you stop attacking yourself, you do not stop learning. You start learning better. You notice causes instead of assigning blame. You see conditions instead of flaws. You become curious rather than critical. And curiosity opens doors that force never could. There is also a hidden arrogance inside violent self-correction. It assumes the mind can be bullied into perfection. It assumes you can control every outcome if you just try hard enough. Buddhism gently exposes this illusion. It reminds us that life is shaped by countless conditions, many of which are not personal failures. When you take responsibility for everything in a harsh way, you carry weight that was never yours to begin with. This weight feels like seriousness, but it is actually misunderstanding. Another quiet harm of relentless self-correction is that it trains you to distrust ease. When something flows naturally, you question it. When progress happens gently, you doubt it. You have learned that growth must hurt to be real. Buddhism offers a different view. It says that suffering is not a requirement for awakening, that peace does not arrive through endurance, but through release. When you stop tightening around yourself, the mind begins to show you what truly needs attention and what can be left alone. This does not mean ignoring mistakes. It means relating to them differently. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" you ask, "What is happening here?" Instead of demanding change, you allow understanding. This shift may feel unfamiliar at first. The judge inside may panic. It may say you are becoming careless. But over time, something surprising happens. Without pressure, the mind becomes more honest. It admits patterns it used to hide. It reveals fears it used to cover with effort. This honesty is the ground of real transformation. The Buddha often spoke about right effort. This does not mean maximum effort. It means appropriate effort. Effort that is balanced. Effort that does not burn the mind. Effort that knows when to act and when to rest. Violent self-correction knows only one speed: faster, harder, more. Right effort listens, it adjusts. It knows that forcing a flower to bloom does not make it grow quicker, it only damages the stem. When you begin to see the subtle violence in how you treat yourself, there may be grief. You may realize how long you have been pushing, how often you denied yourself kindness because you thought it was undeserved. This grief is not a setback. It is a sign of clarity returning. Buddhism does not ask you to punish yourself for this realization. It invites you to bow to it, to acknowledge it, to soften around it. As the need to constantly fix yourself relaxes, space opens. In that space, you may notice something unexpected. You are still learning, you are still changing, but it feels different. There is less fear, less urgency, less self-hatred driving the process. Growth begins to feel like unfolding rather than correction, like remembering rather than forcing. This is how Buddhism distinguishes wisdom from self-attack. Wisdom is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not threaten. It does not rush you toward a better version. It stays with what is here and understands it fully. From that understanding, action arises naturally, without violence, without punishment, without the belief that peace must be earned through pain. And when this understanding settles in, something important becomes clear. You were never broken in the way you thought. You were conditioned. You learned to treat yourself harshly because you believed it was the only way forward. Seeing that belief clearly is already a form of freedom, not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that does not need to prove anything anymore. From here, the path continues, not with pressure, but with honesty. Not with self-correction as a weapon, but with awareness as a guide. And this shift prepares the ground for something deeper to be examined next. Because beneath self-correction, there is often another force holding everything together. One that feels moral, necessary, even noble. Guilt. When the pressure to constantly fix yourself begins to loosen, another feeling often rises to the surface. It doesn't shout, it doesn't rush. It simply sits there, heavy and familiar. It says, even if I stop attacking myself, I still owe something. This is where many people get stuck. The whip is put down, but the weight is still carried. That weight is guilt. Guilt is often misunderstood as a sign of conscience, depth, or goodness. From early on, many of us learn that feeling guilty means we care. That if we stop feeling guilty, something is wrong with us. Guilt becomes proof that we are moral, responsible, and aware. But Buddhism looks at guilt very differently. It does not treat guilt as wisdom. It treats it as attachment, and not just any attachment, but a particularly clever one. At first glance, guilt looks like humility. It looks like accountability. It looks like regret doing its job. But when examined closely, guilt often reveals something else. It keeps the story of me alive, the one who failed, the one who hurt someone, the one who should have known better, the one who must carry this feeling to prove sincerity. This identity becomes familiar. Painful, yes, but familiar. And the mind clings to what it knows, even when it hurts. Buddhism teaches that attachment is not only about pleasure. We can become attached to pain, roles and stories just as strongly. Guilt is one of the most socially acceptable forms of attachment. No one questions it. In fact, people praise it. At least you feel guilty, they say, as if guilt itself were a form of repair. But guilt does not fix what happened. It only keeps the self at the center of the story. When you cling to guilt, the focus quietly shifts. Instead of paying attention to the harm itself, the attention stays on how bad you feel. Instead of responding wisely to consequences, the mind loops around self-judgment. This looping feels like responsibility, but it is actually self-absorption in disguise. The ego survives not by pride alone, but by self-condemnation. Both keep the sense of I strong and active. This is why guilt can last long after a lesson has been learned, long after behavior has changed, long after forgiveness has been offered by others. The guilt remains because it has become part of who you think you are. Letting it go feels wrong, not because the guilt is useful, but because it feels like erasing proof that you cared. The mind whispers, if I stop feeling guilty, it means it didn't matter. Buddhism gently exposes this lie. In Buddhist understanding, remorse and guilt are not the same. Remorse is clean, it sees harm clearly, it acknowledges it, it learns, and then it moves forward with care. Guilt is sticky, it keeps replaying the past, it keeps reopening the wound. It says, I am bad, instead of, that action caused suffering. One leads to wisdom, the other leads to stagnation. Clinging to guilt also creates a false sense of control. As long as you feel guilty, it feels like you are doing something about the past. It feels active. It feels like atonement. But the past cannot be controlled, and trying to manage it through guilt only tightens the mind. Buddhism teaches that true responsibility lives in the present, not in endless punishment for what cannot be changed. There is also fear hidden inside guilt. Fear that without it you will repeat the mistake. Fear that compassion will make you careless. Fear that forgiveness equals permission. But Buddhism does not confuse forgiveness with forgetting or approval. Letting go of guilt does not mean denying harm. It means releasing the emotional attachment to self-blame so that clear action can happen now. When guilt is held tightly, it often blocks real repair. Apologies become heavy and self-centered. Change becomes forced and anxious. Relationships feel strained because guilt demands reassurance. Tell me I'm not a bad person. This is not healing, it is dependence. Buddhism points out that when the self is still busy punishing itself, it cannot fully attend to others. True repair requires presence, not self-absorption. Another overlooked aspect of guilt is how it keeps suffering alive internally, long after it has ended externally. The event is over, the consequence has passed, but the mind keeps recreating it. This repetition feels justified, it feels responsible, but it is still suffering being generated in the present. Buddhism is very clear about this. Suffering created now, even in the name of morality, is still suffering. Letting go of guilt feels uncomfortable at first because the ego protests. The ego says, if I release this, who am I? For many people, guilt has become a form of identity. It gives shape to the self. It gives a role, the one who messed up, the one who carries this burden. Releasing guilt can feel like stepping into emptiness. Buddhism does not see this emptiness as a problem. It sees it as freedom. Spiritual maturity, in Buddhist terms, does not mean being perfect. It means seeing clearly and responding wisely. Carrying guilt indefinitely does not increase wisdom. It dulls it. It narrows perception. It keeps the mind locked in the past. Letting go of guilt opens space for learning to fully integrate. It allows insight to settle instead of being drowned out by self-judgment. There is also a quiet pride hidden in guilt. Not always obvious, but present. I feel worse than others would. I punish myself more than necessary. I will never let myself forget. This extreme self-condemnation can feel noble, but it still centers the self. Buddhism invites humility of a different kind, the humility of recognizing that you are not the center of the universe and that your suffering does not fix what happened. When guilt loosens, something surprising often appears. Care. Care without drama, care without self-hatred. You still don't want to cause harm. In fact, you become more sensitive to it. But your motivation changes. You act from understanding, not fear. From awareness, not punishment. This is why letting go of guilt is not moral failure. It is moral clarity. Buddhist practice often emphasizes releasing unwholesome mental states. Guilt that no longer serves learning is considered unwholesome, not because it is bad, but because it produces more suffering without benefit. Holding onto it is like gripping a hot coal to show how sorry you are. The heat continues, but nothing is healed. There is a difference between taking responsibility and carrying guilt. Responsibility is light enough to move with. Guilt is heavy and paralyzing. Responsibility asks, "What now?" Guilt asks, "What's wrong with me?" One looks forward, the other circles endlessly. Buddhism always points toward freedom from unnecessary suffering, even when the suffering feels justified. Letting go of guilt does not happen through force. You cannot shame yourself out of shame. It happens through understanding. Through seeing that guilt is a mental habit, not a moral requirement. Through noticing how it tightens the body, narrows the breath, and keeps the mind looping. Awareness begins to weaken its grip, not all at once, but gradually. As guilt fades, there may be a strange quiet. The mind may search for something to hold on to. This is normal. Buddhism teaches that the mind is used to clinging. When one attachment loosens, it looks for another. This is why the path continues, not to replace guilt with pride, but to rest in clarity without needing an identity built on pain. When guilt is finally seen for what it is, attachment rather than virtue, a new kind of strength appears, a steadier one. You stop needing to prove that you are good by suffering. You stop measuring sincerity by pain. You begin to trust understanding instead of punishment. This trust does not make you careless. It makes you present. From this place, the question naturally shifts. If guilt is not the path to peace, and self-punishment is not the path to growth, then what is? What allows the mind to finally settle without fear of becoming morally empty? What remains when guilt no longer props up the sense of self? These questions lead directly into the next realization, one that challenges a belief many people hold without ever questioning it, the belief that peace must be earned. When guilt loosens its grip, the mind often reaches for something else to hold itself together. The pain is lighter now, but a quiet question appears underneath it. Have I done enough yet? This question sounds responsible, it sounds mature, it sounds fair, but hidden inside it is another trap, the belief that peace is something you must earn. This belief runs deep. It shows up in small thoughts and big ones. Once I fix this part of myself, then I'll be calm. After I make up for the past, then I can rest. If I just become better, wiser, more disciplined, then peace will arrive. At first, this feels hopeful. It gives direction, it gives motivation, but slowly it turns peace into a prize that is always just out of reach. Buddhism challenges this belief at its root. It says peace is not a reward. It is not a payment for good behavior. It is not something the mind deserves after enough effort. Peace is what is left when the struggle to deserve finally ends. It is uncovered, not achieved. And this distinction changes everything. Merit thinking is the idea that inner states work like moral math. Do enough good, suffer enough, improve enough, and eventually peace will be granted. This way of thinking often comes from religion, culture, and even self-help language. It feels logical. It appeals to fairness. But the mind is not a courtroom, and peace is not a verdict. When you approach inner peace as something to earn, you unknowingly postpone it. This is because merit thinking keeps the mind future-focused. Peace is always later, always conditional, always dependent on becoming someone else. The present moment becomes a waiting room. You're never quite allowed to rest where you are. Even moments of calm are watched closely, measured and questioned. Is this real peace? Do I deserve this? Will it last? These questions quietly pull you back into effort. Buddhism teaches that liberation does not come from adding something to the mind. It comes from removing confusion. Peace is already present beneath the noise, the habits, the clinging. It does not need to be created. It needs to be revealed. But merit thinking covers it up with constant striving. One of the most subtle harms of trying to earn peace is that it keeps self-judgment alive. Even when guilt fades, evaluation remains. You begin to measure your thoughts, your reactions, your spiritual progress. You watch yourself closely, not with curiosity, but with a scorecard. This monitoring feels responsible, but it keeps the sense of me front and center. The one who is improving, the one who is failing, the one who is almost there. In Buddhism, this constant self-referencing is itself a form of suffering. Peace cannot appear fully when the mind is busy tracking its own worthiness. The moment peace is treated as something you must qualify for, it becomes fragile. It depends on conditions, and anything that depends on conditions can be lost. Merit thinking also creates pressure to maintain goodness. You may feel anxious about slipping, afraid that one mistake will undo progress. Calm becomes something to protect rather than something to rest in. This fear tightens the mind. It creates subtle tension even during meditation, reflection, or silence. You are not simply being. You are performing peace. The Buddha pointed out that this performance is exhausting. It keeps the mind busy even when it looks still on the outside. True peace, by contrast, is effortless, not lazy, but unforced. It does not require constant management. It arises naturally when the causes of agitation are understood and released. Another problem with earning peace is that it turns practice into bargaining. If I do this, then I should feel better. If I let go of that, peace should arrive. When peace does not appear on schedule, frustration grows. Doubt follows. The mind begins to feel cheated. This disappointment is not a failure of practice. It is a misunderstanding of what peace is. Peace is not an emotional high. It is not constant pleasure. It is the absence of unnecessary resistance. It is the mind no longer fighting what is. When you try to earn it, you add resistance instead of removing it. You resist your current state. You resist not being calm enough. You resist the process itself. Buddhism emphasizes seeing things as they are. This includes seeing the desire to earn peace as another form of craving. It is craving disguised as virtue. You want peace because you believe something is wrong without it. That belief creates tension, and the tension blocks the very thing you are seeking. When merit thinking loosens, a strange relief appears. You realize you are not late, you are not behind. There is no final exam for peace. This does not mean effort disappears. It means effort becomes wiser. You practice not to become worthy, but to see clearly. And seeing clearly brings calm naturally. The Buddha often spoke about awakening as remembering, not achieving, like realizing you were holding your breath unnecessarily. When you stop holding, relief comes instantly. Not because you earned oxygen, but because you stopped blocking it. Peace works the same way. Trying to deserve peace also keeps comparison alive. You look at others and wonder who is more advanced, who is calmer, who is doing it right. This comparison feeds insecurity. It makes peace feel scarce, like only a few can have it. Buddhism rejects this completely. Peace is not a limited resource. It is available whenever the conditions of clinging soften. Merit thinking can also create pride. I worked hard for this calm. I suffered enough to deserve this. This pride may feel subtle, but it creates separation. It strengthens identity, and where identity tightens, peace thins out. Buddhism teaches that peace deepens as the sense of a solid self relaxes, not as it is polished. Another overlooked cost of earning peace is burnout. Many people become tired of trying to be better all the time. They give up, not because peace is impossible, but because the approach was exhausting. They confuse the failure of the method with the failure of the path. Buddhism would say the effort was pointed in the wrong direction. Too much doing, not enough seeing. Peace uncovered feels different from peace earned. Earned peace feels conditional. It feels like it could disappear if you slip. Uncovered peace feels stable. It does not depend on perfection. It allows mistakes without collapse. It allows emotions without panic. This stability comes from understanding, not control. Letting go of merit thinking can feel risky. The mind may ask, if I stop striving, will I become careless? Buddhism answers this clearly. When you see suffering clearly, you naturally avoid causing it. You don't need punishment or rewards to guide you. Understanding becomes the guide. This is a more reliable foundation than fear or ambition. There is also a deep kindness in realizing peace is not earned. It means you do not have to wait to be worthy. You do not have to become someone else. You do not have to clean yourself up before resting. This kindness is not indulgence. It is realism. It acknowledges that struggle does not purify the mind. Clarity does. As this insight settles, the mind begins to rest more easily in the present. Not because everything is resolved, but because the demand for resolution has softened. You stop postponing peace. You stop treating calm as a finish line. You begin to notice quiet moments that were always there, but ignored because they didn't feel earned. This shift does not make life perfect. Challenges remain, emotions still rise, but they are met differently, without the added layer of "I shouldn't be feeling this yet," without the belief that peace has been delayed. The mind becomes more spacious, less defensive, more honest. When peace is understood as uncovered rather than deserved, practice becomes lighter. You engage with life directly, not as a test, but as a teacher. Every experience becomes informative rather than evaluative. This is liberation in the Buddhist sense. Not escape from life, but freedom within it. As merit thinking fades, another realization quietly appears. Even without striving, suffering still arises at times. Old habits resurface, reactions happen, and when they do, a new temptation emerges. The urge to judge yourself harshly again, to see suffering as failure, to turn inward with blame. This brings us to another layer that must be understood. How the mind creates future pain through self-judgment itself. The unseen consequences of turning against yourself. The karma of self-hatred. As merit thinking starts to fade, the mind finally tastes a quieter kind of relief. Not the relief of "I passed," but the relief of no longer having to audition for peace. And yet, even in that new space, something old can still rise up fast. A familiar reflex, a harsh comment toward yourself, a sudden tightening in the chest, a thought that says, "See, you're still like this." It can happen after a small mistake, a strong emotion, a relapse into an old habit, or even a day when you simply feel low for no clear reason. This is the moment many people don't understand. They assume they've returned to the beginning. They assume the calm was fake. They assume the path is broken. But what's really happening is deeper. The mind is showing you one of its strongest old habits. Self-hatred disguised as being realistic. And Buddhism treats this not as a minor issue, not as a personality quirk, but as a cause that plants suffering into the future the same way harmful actions toward others do. Self-hatred often gets a free pass because it looks private. No one sees it. No one gets bruised on the outside. You can still function, still work, still smile, still be fine. But inwardly, a war is taking place, and Buddhism is very clear about one thing: the mind does not escape the effects of what it repeatedly creates. Inner cruelty is still cruelty. It still leaves traces. It still shapes your next moment, your next choice, your next relationship with life. In Buddhist teaching, karma is not a punishment handed down by the universe. It is a pattern of cause and effect. It is the way intention shapes the mind. What you repeat becomes your direction. What you feed becomes your home. Every time you strike yourself with harsh judgment, you strengthen the habit of striking. Even if the target is you, the action is still the same kind of action. It is aggression, and aggression, repeated, becomes a condition that returns suffering again and again. This is why self-hatred never stays in one place. It spreads. It leaks into how you interpret events. It leaks into how you treat your body. It leaks into how you speak, how you listen, how you handle conflict, how you handle success, how you handle love. Self-hatred becomes a lens, and when you wear that lens long enough, the world starts to look like evidence against you. Harsh self-judgment creates future suffering in a very practical way. It trains the brain to search for failure. It makes you overly alert to what's wrong. That vigilance feels like safety, but it is actually stress. When the mind expects attack, it becomes defensive. And a defensive mind is less flexible, less creative, less patient, and more reactive. So the very habit you use to improve becomes the habit that makes life harder. A self-hating mind also changes how you learn. Learning requires openness. It requires being able to see your actions clearly without collapsing into shame. But when the mind believes mistakes equal worthlessness, it stops learning cleanly. It becomes afraid of seeing. It becomes afraid of honesty. It starts hiding, rationalizing, avoiding, or overcompensating. The mistake is no longer a lesson. It becomes a threat to identity. This is one way self-hatred creates future mistakes, which then create more self-hatred. The wheel turns smoothly because the mind calls it discipline. Another way self-hatred plants suffering is through the body. A harsh inner voice is not just words, it is chemistry. It is tension in the shoulders, tightness in the throat, a shallow breath, a stomach that won't settle. Over time, living under inner attack trains the nervous system to stay on guard. Even when nothing is happening, the body stays ready for danger. Sleep becomes lighter, rest becomes harder. Peace feels unfamiliar. You may call it anxiety, but often it is simply the body adapting to an environment that never became safe. The environment is internal. Buddhism speaks of suffering as something you can feel directly, not only as an idea. The body is part of the mind's karma. When you repeatedly treat yourself like an enemy, the body starts living like it is surrounded by enemies. This is why self-hatred can feel exhausting even on quiet days. The mind is not only thinking painful thoughts, it is maintaining a state of war. Self-hatred also shapes the future through how you relate to pleasure and goodness. When you dislike yourself, joy can trigger suspicion. You may feel that ease is not allowed, that happiness is irresponsible, that comfort is a trap. You might unconsciously sabotage good moments because they don't match your inner identity. If you've lived as the one who is wrong, then being okay feels like a lie. The mind may pull you back into familiar pain because it feels true. This is one of the saddest forms of karma. Suffering becomes a comfort zone. There is also the karma of shrinking. When self-hatred is present, you take fewer risks. You speak less honestly. You reach out less. You try less. Not because you don't want life, but because you expect yourself to fail. You may call it being realistic, but it is often fear wrapped in self-judgment. And each time you shrink, the mind learns a lesson. The world is too dangerous for me. That lesson becomes a future prison. Buddhism points out that intention matters. If your intention is to harm yourself through judgment, even subtly, the mind absorbs that intention. It becomes the background tone. You may meditate, pray, read wise teachings, listen to calm voices, but the inner tone still says, "I do not deserve to be at ease." That tone becomes the real teacher because it is repeated most often. This is why outwardly good actions can still feel empty when self-hatred remains. You can help others and still feel unworthy. You can achieve success and still feel like a fraud. You can receive love and still feel like you are borrowing something that will be taken back. The problem is not the world. The problem is the inner conclusion. And every time you repeat that conclusion, you plant it deeper. Self-hatred also affects how you interpret other people. When you carry harsh judgment inside, you tend to expect judgment outside. You assume others see you the way you see you. You may misread neutral expressions as rejection. You may take small feedback as a personal attack. You may anticipate betrayal even when no betrayal is happening. This creates future suffering in relationships, not because people are cruel, but because the mind is scanning for proof. And when it scans long enough, it finds something, or it creates something through tense behavior, distance, or defensiveness. This is an important point in Buddhist psychology. States of mind condition perception. A mind filled with self-hatred does not see clearly. It sees through pain. So even if the world offers kindness, it may not land. Even if someone forgives you, you may not believe it. Even if life gives you a fresh start, you may feel you must keep paying for the past. The suffering continues not because the past is still happening, but because the mind keeps recreating it. Karma is also habit energy. The mind moves where it has moved before. If you have practiced self-hate for years, it becomes fast, automatic. It appears before wisdom has time to speak. This is why a small mistake can trigger a big collapse. The collapse isn't about the mistake, it's about the deep pathway that is already carved. Buddhism does not blame you for having this pathway. It simply says, what is conditioned can be reconditioned, but it must be seen clearly, and it must be met with a different intention. A harsh mind often believes it is preventing future harm. If I punish myself, I won't do it again. But look closely. Has self-hatred truly made you kinder? Has it truly made you calmer? Has it truly made you more stable? Often it does the opposite. It makes you more tense, and tension increases reactivity. It makes you more ashamed, and shame increases hiding. It makes you more fearful, and fear increases compulsive behavior. So the intended result fails, and the mind concludes it must become even harsher. This is how the cycle maintains itself. Buddhism offers another view. Ethical change grows best in a mind that is steady, not a mind that is whipped. When the mind is steady, it can pause before acting. It can feel consequences. It can care. When the mind is whipped, it acts from panic or pressure. It becomes more likely to repeat what it later regrets. So if you truly care about not causing harm, self-hatred is a poor strategy. It looks like seriousness, but it breeds instability. There is also the karma of hopelessness. Self-hatred quietly teaches you that you are permanently flawed, that your nature is wrong, that you are the kind of person who will always struggle. This belief creates future suffering by draining motivation and courage. Why try if you are already condemned? Why open up if you are already unworthy? Why practice if you are already failing? Hopelessness is not just a mood, it is a worldview. And it becomes self-fulfilling because it blocks the actions that would create change. Buddhism does not say you must love yourself in a dramatic way. It does not demand affirmations or forced positivity. It asks for something simpler and more honest. Stop adding suffering on top of suffering. Stop turning pain into identity. Stop turning mistakes into proof of worthlessness. This is not indulgence, it is wisdom, because it recognizes cause and effect. The karma of self-hatred is also spiritual. When you hate yourself, you strengthen separation. You create a split between me and me. One side becomes the controller, the other becomes the thing controlled. This split creates constant inner friction. Buddhism aims at ending separation, not polishing it. It points toward wholeness, where experience can arise without being attacked. where thoughts can appear without being judged into punishment. This is where the concept of non-harming becomes personal. Many people think non-harming means not hurting others. Buddhism includes that, but it goes further. It asks, are you harming the mind right now? Are you harming the heart right now? Are you planting seeds of cruelty inside your own awareness? Because those seeds do not stay hidden. They grow. They shape speech. They shape decisions. They shape the way you treat people when you are tired, stressed, disappointed, or afraid. Self-hatred also blocks insight by keeping the mind cloudy. A mind in hatred is not curious. It is condemning. It does not ask, what led to this action? It says, I am terrible. That statement feels final, but it explains nothing. It reveals nothing. It teaches nothing. It is a dead end. Buddhism values insight, which means seeing conditions, causes, and patterns. Insight leads to freedom because it reveals what can change. Self-hatred hides conditions under a blanket of identity. That is why it creates future suffering. It prevents the very understanding that would end the pattern. There is a form of karma that comes from how you speak to yourself. Words become atmosphere. If the inner language is harsh, the inner world becomes harsh. Even when you are alone, you are living in a certain environment. Over time, that environment shapes your temperament. You may become less patient, less trusting, more cynical, more withdrawn. You may not connect these traits to self-hatred, but the link is strong. Living under constant criticism produces a certain kind of personality. The same way living under constant rain produces a certain kind of landscape. And still, many people keep self-hatred because it feels like truth. They confuse intensity with honesty. They think gentleness is denial. Buddhism challenges this. It says the most honest mind is the least offensive, the least violent. The mind that sees clearly does not need to scream. It does not need to insult. It does not need to crush the self. It simply sees cause and effect and responds wisely. So what breaks the karma of self-hatred? Not more hatred toward the hatred, not a new inner war. The first step is recognition, not intellectual, but real recognition. The kind that catches the moment the mind turns sharp, the moment the body tightens, the moment the inner voice becomes cruel. And then, instead of believing it, you name it quietly. This is self-hatred. Naming it matters because it separates awareness from the attack. It reminds you that a thought is not a verdict. It is a mental event arising from conditions. Next comes a new intention. Not to pretend everything is fine, but to refuse cruelty as a method. In Buddhism, intention is powerful. The moment you choose, I will not use harm to create wisdom, you change the direction of karma. Even if the harsh voice still appears, it is now appearing in a different environment. An environment where it is not automatically obeyed. This is where compassion becomes practical. Compassion is not a mood, it is a stance. It is the choice to meet suffering without adding violence. When you treat your own suffering with basic kindness, you interrupt the chain reaction. The body relaxes a little. The mind becomes a little more spacious. From that space, you can actually see what needs to be learned. This is how compassion creates real responsibility. It clears the mind so it can respond instead of react. Buddhist practices like loving kindness are not sentimental. They are medicine for a mind trained in cruelty. They are a way of planting new seeds. If you have planted self-hate for years, you cannot expect a new crop overnight. But you can begin. A few moments of non-harming today is a new karmic cause. A softer response after a mistake is a new cause. A willingness to pause instead of attack is a new cause. These causes accumulate quietly, the same way harm accumulates quietly. The mind becomes what it practices. There is also a deep relief in realizing you are allowed to be a human being without punishment. You can regret without self-destruction. You can learn without being crushed. You can take responsibility without building a prison. This relief does not make you careless. It makes you steady, and steadiness is the ground where good actions become natural instead of forced. Over time, as self-hatred weakens, you start to notice changes that are not dramatic but real. You recover faster from mistakes. You become less afraid of feedback. You become more honest in relationships. You stop assuming rejection. You stop treating calm as suspicious. You begin to trust the present moment more. This is karma too. A new pattern of cause and effect. A new future being built from a different kind of mind. And then something even more important becomes visible. Self-hatred was never only about the mistake. It was about the story the mind created afterward. The story that turned a moment into an identity. The story that replayed itself like a trial that never ends. When you see this clearly, the next question appears naturally. If harsh judgment creates suffering into the future, then what happens when remorse itself turns into who you think you are? What happens when the mind stops saying, "That was wrong," and starts saying, "This is what I am"? That is where the next layer begins. When the harshness begins to soften and self-hatred is finally seen as a cause of suffering rather than a solution, another pattern quietly reveals itself. The mind no longer lashes out as often, but it still holds on to something familiar. A label, a role, a story that feels heavy but stable. It says, "This is who I am now." Not angry, not dramatic, just settled. And that is where remorse quietly turns into identity. This shift happens slowly. At first, remorse is honest. It arises because something mattered. It reflects care, awareness, and sensitivity. Buddhism never rejects remorse. In fact, it values it deeply. Remorse is what allows learning to begin. It is the moment the mind recognizes harm without denial. But there is a line that often gets crossed without being noticed. The line between seeing an action clearly and becoming the action. When remorse becomes identity, the mind stops saying, "That was wrong," and starts saying, "I am wrong." The difference may sound small, but the effect is enormous. One statement allows growth. The other freezes it. One points to behavior. The other defines being. Buddhism is very precise here. It teaches that actions arise from conditions, but the self is not fixed. When the mind collapses into identity, it locks those conditions in place. The identity of the one who failed can feel strangely solid. Painful, yes, but solid. It gives the mind something to hold on to, a clear explanation for suffering, a familiar position. The mind prefers a painful certainty over an open unknown. So even when change is possible, identity resists it. Letting go of the label feels like erasing history, denying responsibility, or pretending nothing happened. This fear keeps the identity alive. Buddhism teaches that clinging to identity is a central cause of suffering. Identity creates separation. It draws hard lines around experience. When remorse turns into identity, the past becomes the present. Every new moment is filtered through what you believe you are. You may notice this in small ways. Compliments feel uncomfortable. Opportunities feel undeserved. Hope feels naive. The future feels already decided. This identity also shapes memory. Instead of remembering an event as something that happened, the mind remembers it as proof. Every recall reinforces the same conclusion. The memory is no longer informational. It is defining. Over time, the memory loses detail and gains weight. It stops teaching and starts accusing. Buddhism calls this proliferation, the mind repeating and expanding a story until it becomes a world you live inside. When remorse becomes identity, it also distorts responsibility. True responsibility is flexible. It adjusts. It responds to the present. Identity-based remorse is rigid. It says, "I will always be this." This rigidity blocks movement. You may find yourself repeating apologies that go nowhere, making changes that feel hollow, or avoiding situations where your identity might be challenged. Growth feels threatening because it contradicts the story. There is also a quiet loyalty to the identity of failure. It can feel like betraying those you hurt if you move on too easily. The mind says, if I stop carrying this, it means I didn't care enough. Buddhism recognizes this as attachment to suffering. Caring does not require self-definition through pain. In fact, ongoing self-definition through pain often keeps attention on the self rather than on wiser action. Another danger of remorse as identity is that it limits compassion. When you believe you are fundamentally flawed, you may struggle to believe others can change. You may judge quickly. You may expect disappointment. Or you may excuse harm because you believe people are stuck. The inner story becomes a lens through which you see the world. Buddhism points out that seeing impermanence clearly is what allows compassion to stay alive. Identity denies impermanence. The identity of failure also changes how you practice spiritually. Practice becomes a way to fix who you are rather than understand what is happening. Meditation becomes heavy. Reflection becomes self-analysis. Teachings feel distant, as if they apply to better people. This is not humility. It is a misunderstanding of the path. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not about becoming worthy. It is about seeing clearly that the fixed self you are trying to repair does not exist in the way you think. Remorse without self-definition looks very different. It is clean. It acknowledges harm fully, without drama and without denial. It feels the weight of consequence without turning it into identity. It learns, adjusts, and releases. Buddhism often uses the metaphor of seeing a thorn and removing it. You don't keep the thorn to prove you were hurt. You remove it so the wound can heal. One of the reasons remorse turns into identity is that the mind mistakes intensity for truth. Strong feelings feel convincing. If the pain is deep, the conclusion must be real. But Buddhism teaches that intensity does not equal accuracy. Emotions arise due to conditions. They pass when conditions change. Identity claims permanence where there is none. This is why the Buddha emphasized non-self, not as an abstract idea, but as a practical tool. When you see that thoughts, emotions, and memories arise and pass, the grip of identity weakens. You can experience remorse without becoming remorse. You can feel regret without turning into the regretful one. This creates space, and in that space, wisdom functions. Another subtle harm of remorse as identity is how it affects time. The past becomes heavy. The future becomes thin. You may feel like you're living behind your own life, always catching up, always compensating. Buddhism teaches that liberation happens now, not because the past disappears, but because it stops defining the present. When identity loosens, time opens. There is also a social cost. When you see yourself as the one who failed, you may unconsciously seek situations that confirm it. You may tolerate poor treatment. You may stay small. You may avoid joy because it feels out of character. This is not fate, it is conditioning. Buddhism teaches that identity shapes behavior, and behavior shapes future conditions. The cycle continues until it is seen. Remorse as identity can also create a strange form of pride. I will never forgive myself. I will always remember. These statements sound noble, but they still center the self. Buddhism invites a different humility, the humility of letting go, the humility of accepting that clinging to pain does not make you more ethical. It makes you less free. Learning to hold remorse without self-definition takes practice. The mind is used to collapsing. It wants clear labels. Buddhism offers tools to interrupt this habit. One is careful attention to language. Notice when the mind uses I am instead of this happened. Another is returning to the body. Identity lives in thought. The body lives in the present. Feeling the breath, the weight of the body, the contact with the ground brings you back to what is real now. Another tool is seeing conditions. Instead of isolating the self as the cause, you widen the lens. What pressures were present? What habits were active? What misunderstandings were operating? This is not excuse-making. It is accuracy. Buddhism values accuracy because it leads to effective change. Blame simplifies. Understanding liberates. When remorse is freed from identity, forgiveness becomes possible. Not forced forgiveness, not sentimental forgiveness, but practical forgiveness, the kind that allows you to act differently now. You stop carrying the past as a badge or a burden. You carry the lesson instead. This is what spiritual maturity looks like in Buddhism. Not purity, but flexibility. Not perfection, but responsiveness. It is important to see that letting go of identity does not erase memory. You still remember. But memory becomes information, not accusation. It informs choices rather than condemning being. This shift is subtle but powerful. Life becomes less heavy, not because nothing mattered, but because you stop turning meaning into punishment. As this understanding deepens, you may notice moments where the old identity tries to return, especially when you are tired, stressed, or disappointed. The mind may say, "Here it is again. This proves it." This is not failure, it is habit energy. Buddhism teaches patience here. Not indulgence, but steadiness. Each time you see the pattern without feeding it, the identity weakens. There is a quiet relief in realizing you do not have to be a fixed version of your past. That your worst moment is not your name. That remorse can exist without becoming a prison. This relief does not make you careless. It makes you more available to others, available to growth, available to peace. And yet, even as identity loosens, another temptation often appears. The mind may begin to punish itself, not for who it is, but for how it feels. Pain becomes proof of seriousness. Suffering becomes a measure of sincerity. This introduces a new illusion, the belief that punishment itself is productive, that hurting inside means something is being fixed. This belief feels active, it feels responsible. But it hides another misunderstanding, one that must be seen clearly if peace is to deepen. As the old identity loosens and remorse no longer defines who you are, the mind often searches for another way to feel grounded. The labels begin to fall away, but something inside still feels exposed. Without the familiar weight of guilt or identity, uncertainty appears, and right there, almost automatically, another habit steps in. A habit that feels active, serious, and responsible: self-punishment. At first, self-punishment feels useful. It feels like doing something. When things feel unclear, unstable, or unresolved, punishing yourself creates a sense of structure. Pain becomes a boundary. Harshness becomes direction. The mind says, "At least I'm not ignoring this." And in that moment, uncertainty feels smaller. This is why self-punishment is so convincing. It creates the illusion of control. Control is deeply comforting to the human mind. Not because control is pleasant, but because uncertainty is frightening. When you don't know what will happen next, when you can't guarantee that you won't repeat a mistake, when you can't be sure you're growing fast enough, the mind panics quietly. Self-punishment steps in as a response to that panic. It says, "If I hurt myself now, I can prevent worse pain later." Buddhism looks directly at this belief and gently dismantles it. Punishing yourself feels productive because it mimics effort. It has intensity. It has urgency. It feels like responsibility in action. Sitting with uncertainty feels passive by comparison. Waiting, not knowing, allowing life to unfold feels risky. So the mind chooses pain because pain feels like movement. But movement is not the same as progress. Buddhism teaches that not all effort is wise effort. Some effort comes from fear, not clarity. Self-punishment belongs to this category. It is an attempt to force certainty where none exists. There is the mind saying, "I don't trust life, so I will tighten myself instead." That tightening creates temporary relief, but it does not resolve the fear underneath. It only distracts from it. When you punish yourself, you create a sense of moral order. You feel that something has been balanced. I did wrong, now I suffer. This feels fair, predictable, contained, but life does not work like a simple exchange. Suffering does not cancel suffering, and inner pain does not guarantee wiser action. Buddhism points out that this moral bookkeeping keeps the mind busy, but it does not make it free. The illusion of control shows up strongly after mistakes. The future suddenly feels uncertain. What if I do this again? What if I hurt someone again? What if I never change? These questions are uncomfortable because they have no immediate answers. Self-punishment gives the mind something concrete to do with that discomfort. It turns fear into pain. Pain feels familiar. Fear of the unknown does not. This is why many people punish themselves more when they care deeply. Caring increases uncertainty. When something matters, the risk feels higher. So the mind tries to protect what matters by tightening control. It believes that if it stays harsh enough, vigilant enough, unforgiving enough, it can prevent future harm. Buddhism does not deny the intention behind this. It questions the method. Fear of uncertainty is at the core of this habit. Uncertainty means you cannot guarantee outcomes. You cannot guarantee you will always act wisely. You cannot guarantee that change will stick. For the ego, this is terrifying. The ego wants assurance. It wants certainty. Self-punishment offers a false form of assurance. It says, as long as I'm hurting, I'm in control. But control achieved through pain is unstable. It requires constant reinforcement. The moment the pain eases, fear returns. This creates a cycle. Uncertainty arises. Self-punishment reduces it temporarily. Relief fades. Uncertainty returns. The punishment must intensify. Over time, the mind becomes dependent on harshness to feel safe. Gentleness feels dangerous. Calm feels irresponsible. Peace feels like losing vigilance. This is how self-punishment becomes habitual, even when it no longer feels effective. Buddhism teaches that true stability does not come from control, but from understanding impermanence. Everything changes. Conditions shift. Outcomes cannot be fully predicted. When the mind resists this truth, it suffers. When it accepts this truth, it relaxes. Self-punishment is a refusal to accept impermanence. It is an attempt to freeze the future through pain. There is also a belief hidden inside self-punishment that says suffering is a form of insurance. If I hurt now, life won't hurt me later. But this belief misunderstands how suffering works. Inner cruelty does not protect you from outer pain. It often makes you more vulnerable to it. A harsh mind is less flexible, less resilient, less able to adapt when things don't go as planned. Buddhism values resilience over rigidity. Another reason self-punishment feels productive is that it gives the mind a clear role. You become the enforcer, the controller, the one making sure things don't fall apart. This role gives identity and purpose. Letting go of it can feel like abandoning responsibility. But Buddhism distinguishes responsibility from domination. Responsibility responds, domination controls. One allows learning, the other blocks it. Self-punishment also simplifies complex situations. Life is messy. Mistakes arise from many conditions: emotions, habits, stress, misunderstanding, timing. Seeing this complexity requires patience. Punishing yourself collapses complexity into one conclusion: I am the problem. This feels clean, simple, but it is inaccurate, and inaccurate understanding creates future suffering. When you punish yourself, you also train your nervous system to associate learning with pain. Over time, this makes growth harder. The mind begins to resist insight because insight predicts punishment. Awareness becomes threatening. Reflection becomes uncomfortable. You may avoid looking closely at yourself because you know what's coming. This is how self-punishment quietly blocks the very clarity it claims to support. Buddhism emphasizes that awareness should feel spacious, not punishing. When awareness is gentle, the mind opens. When awareness is harsh, the mind contracts. A contracted mind cannot see clearly. It sees through fear, and fear distorts perception. This is why self-punishment ultimately increases uncertainty instead of resolving it. It clouds the mind while pretending to guide it. Another hidden cost of self-punishment is how it affects trust. Not just trust in others, but trust in yourself. If every mistake leads to inner attack, the mind learns that being human is dangerous. It becomes hypervigilant. It second-guesses every impulse. This constant monitoring feels like control, but it actually creates anxiety. Buddhism teaches that trust grows when the mind feels safe enough to be honest. Self-punishment removes that safety. There is also a deep fatigue that comes from trying to control life through pain. You may notice that even when nothing is wrong, you feel tense. Even during calm moments, part of you is bracing. This is the residue of self-punishment. The body remembers the stance of control. Relaxation feels unfamiliar. Letting go feels like losing grip on reality. Buddhism invites a different relationship with uncertainty. Instead of treating uncertainty as a threat, it treats it as a fact, a neutral condition of life. When uncertainty is accepted, the need for control softens. The mind no longer has to tighten itself to feel safe. It learns to respond moment by moment, rather than trying to dominate the future. This does not mean passivity. It means responsiveness. When you are no longer punishing yourself, you can actually respond more wisely to situations as they arise. You are less reactive, less defensive, more present. Ironically, letting go of control increases your ability to act skillfully, because your actions come from clarity, not fear. Self-punishment also creates a false sense of progress. Pain feels like movement, so the mind assumes something is changing. But suffering alone does not guarantee learning. Buddhism makes this clear. Learning happens when the mind sees cause and effect clearly. Pain can accompany learning, but it is not the teacher. Understanding is the teacher. There is a quiet courage required to stop punishing yourself, because when you stop, uncertainty becomes visible. There is no buffer, no punishment to lean on, just the present moment, with all its unpredictability. This can feel exposed at first. The mind may protest. It may say, "You're being careless." But over time, something else emerges, a steadier confidence. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in awareness. This confidence does not promise that you will never make mistakes again. It promises something more realistic. That when mistakes happen, you will be able to meet them without collapsing. That you will be able to learn without cruelty. That you will be able to adjust without fear. Buddhism values this kind of confidence because it is grounded in reality, not fantasy. When self-punishment loosens, the fear of uncertainty does not disappear overnight, but it becomes workable. You begin to see that uncertainty is not an enemy. It is simply the space where life happens. Trying to control that space through pain only makes it smaller. Allowing it gives it room to breathe. As this understanding deepens, the mind starts to question another long-held assumption, the idea that there must be a perfect balance between being harsh and being indifferent, the fear that if you let go of punishment, you'll slide into apathy. This fear leads many people to stay trapped between shame and numbness. They believe there is no middle ground, but Buddhism points to something quieter, more stable, and rarely talked about. A way to be accountable without destroying yourself. A middle way that does not rely on pain or avoidance. As the need to control the future through pain begins to loosen, a new fear often appears, quieter but sharp. It says, if I'm not hard on myself, I'll become careless. It says, if I stop feeling bad, I'll stop being good. And for many people, this fear becomes the final reason they keep suffering. They don't keep punishing themselves because it works. They keep punishing themselves because they're scared of the other extreme, indifference. Here is the trap. The mind thinks there are only two options. Either you drown in shame or you become cold. Either you crush yourself for mistakes or you pretend nothing matters. Either you carry pain as proof of conscience or you become the kind of person who never changes. That false choice keeps people stuck for years. and it's exactly the kind of confusion the Buddha was addressing when he taught the middle way. Something inside you already knows this matters. You can feel it when you're exhausted from beating yourself up, yet still afraid to let go. You can feel it when you want to be responsible without turning your heart into a courtroom. You can feel it when you want to face what you did without turning it into who you are. That desire is not weakness. It's the beginning of balance. The middle way is often misunderstood as being in the middle emotionally, like staying neutral, like never feeling strongly. But that's not what it is. The middle way is not a personality type. It's a way of relating to reality that avoids two dead ends: self-destruction and avoidance. It's honesty without cruelty. It's responsibility without self-harm. It's care without panic. It's the ability to say, "This mattered," without saying, "Therefore I deserve to suffer." Shame is not the same as responsibility. Shame is the feeling that you are fundamentally wrong. It doesn't simply point to an action. It attacks your core. It says you are broken, dirty, unworthy, less than. Shame makes everything personal. Even learning becomes dangerous because learning requires looking closely, and shame turns every look into a punishment. Shame does not open the mind. It shuts it down. It might force short-term obedience, but it creates long-term fear, and fear is not a stable foundation for ethical living. Indifference is the other dead end, and it has its own disguise. It looks like strength sometimes. It looks like moving on. It looks like not caring what people think. But often, indifference is not peace. It is shutdown. It is the heart going numb because feeling became too painful. It is the mind choosing distance because closeness required vulnerability. Indifference avoids shame, but it also avoids growth. It avoids repair. It avoids depth. It avoids the truth that actions have consequences and people have feelings. The middle way refuses both. It does not worship pain, and it does not run from truth. It allows remorse to exist without letting it become identity. It allows accountability to be real without turning it into self-hatred. And this is where many people get confused, because they've never been taught what accountability feels like when it's healthy. Healthy accountability feels clear. It is direct, it is specific, it is focused on behavior and impact, not on character and worth. It asks, what happened? What was the result? What conditions led to it? What can be done now? It does not ask, how bad am I? It does not ask, how much should I suffer? Those questions are not moral questions. They are self-punishment questions. They keep you stuck in the self instead of moving toward wisdom. In Buddhism, ethics is not built on shame. It is built on understanding suffering. When you understand that harm creates suffering, you naturally want to reduce harm. Not because you are terrified of being bad, but because you see clearly. You see how anger burns the one who holds it. You see how lies create fear. You see how careless words damage trust. You see how selfishness isolates. This seeing is not dramatic. It's simply honest, and honesty, when it's free from self-attack, becomes incredibly powerful. One reason people cling to shame is that shame feels like proof of sincerity. If you feel terrible, you must be taking it seriously. If you punish yourself, you must be moral. But sincerity is not measured by pain. It is measured by willingness to learn and adjust. The mind can suffer for years and still repeat the same patterns. That suffering might look like depth, but it can be a loop. Sincerity is shown in how you relate to the next moment, the next choice, the next conversation, the next opportunity to do better. The middle way teaches you to separate two things that shame blends together: the fact of the mistake and the story about the self. The fact is simple. Something happened. It had an effect. It can be acknowledged. It can be addressed. The story is what creates extra suffering. This proves I'm hopeless. This means I'm unlovable. This means I don't deserve peace. Buddhism treats this story as mental construction, not as truth. When you drop the story, you don't drop responsibility, you drop the poison. A key part of the middle way is learning how to hold discomfort without turning it into self-destruction. Because accountability involves discomfort. If you caused harm, you will feel something. If you broke trust, you will feel something. If you acted against your values, you will feel something. The middle way does not numb this. It allows the discomfort to be felt as information, but it refuses to turn it into violence. Here is how that looks in real life. You notice the tightness in your chest after you realize you hurt someone. Instead of spiraling into "I'm a terrible person," you stay with the sensation and the fact. You admit clearly that hurt them. You allow remorse to arise without adding a second arrow. In Buddhism, the first arrow is the natural pain of life. The second arrow is the extra pain created by the mind's resistance and self-attack. Shame fires the second arrow again and again. The middle way puts the bow down. Accountability without self-destruction also means making repair without begging for punishment. This is important. Many people unconsciously seek punishment because punishment feels like closure. If someone yells at you, if you are rejected, if you suffer enough, then the mind feels the debt is paid. But life does not always offer that kind of clear ending. Sometimes repair is quiet. Sometimes forgiveness is slow. Sometimes people move on without giving you the emotional release of being punished. The middle way teaches you to live without needing punishment as proof. You repair what you can. You apologize where it's appropriate. You change behavior. And you accept that the rest is not yours to control. This is where spiritual maturity shows up, not in being perfect, but in being steady when there is no guarantee. Shame demands a dramatic emotional payment. Indifference refuses payment entirely. The middle way pays with presence and action. It says, "I am here. I will not disappear. I will face what happened. I will not abuse myself. I will do what is skillful now." Another part of balance is understanding intention without using it as an excuse. Sometimes harm happens without malice. Sometimes you were overwhelmed. Sometimes you were ignorant. Sometimes you were acting out of fear. The middle way can acknowledge this without minimizing impact. It can say, "I didn't mean to hurt you," and also say, "But I did, and I care." Shame turns intention into a courtroom defense or a personal condemnation. Indifference turns intention into a free pass. The middle way holds both realities, the inner causes and the outer consequences. To practice this, Buddhism often emphasizes mindfulness and clear comprehension. Mindfulness notices what is happening. Clear comprehension understands what is helpful and what is harmful. Together, they create a kind of inner leadership that does not require brutality. You start to catch the moment when the mind wants to swing to extremes, the moment it wants to collapse into shame, the moment it wants to shut down into whatever. You see the swing, and because you see it, you are not forced to obey it. A useful sign to watch for is urgency. Shame is urgent. It wants immediate emotional punishment. It says, "Fix this now by hurting." Indifference is also urgent in a different way. It says, "Get away from this feeling now." The middle way has less urgency. It can wait, it can stay, it can breathe. It understands that real change is often slow and that forcing speed creates distortion. This patience is not laziness, it is stability. Another sign is clarity. Shame creates fog. It overwhelms the mind with global conclusions. Everything becomes always and never. Indifference creates blankness. It avoids details so nothing has to be faced. The middle way is detailed. It stays specific. I raised my voice. I broke a promise. I avoided a conversation. Specificity is powerful because it gives you something real to work with. You can't repair, "I am awful." You can repair, "I didn't show up when I said I would." Accountability without emotional self-destruction also includes boundaries. This is often missed. People think compassion means letting everyone treat them however they want, or they think responsibility means accepting endless blame. The middle way is not being a doormat. You can acknowledge your role without accepting unfair punishment. You can apologize without allowing manipulation. You can be humble without abandoning your dignity. Buddhism calls this wisdom, not pride. This is especially important because some people around you may prefer you in shame. Your shame can make them feel powerful, or your shame can make conflict simple for them. If you stay in shame, you are easy to control. The middle way may challenge the dynamics in relationships. It might feel uncomfortable at first because it is new. You may need to learn to say, "I hear you and I'm taking this seriously, but I will not attack myself to make this easier." That sentence is not arrogance, it is sanity. Indifference often develops when shame becomes unbearable, so if you have swung into numbness before, that is not a sign you don't care. It may be a sign you cared too much while having no healthy way to hold it. The middle way offers a third option: feeling without drowning, facing without collapsing, caring without bleeding out internally. This balance also changes how you relate to your own inner critic. Shame gives the critic the microphone. Indifference throws the whole microphone away. The middle way listens for the useful signal and ignores the abuse. Sometimes the critic contains information. That wasn't skillful. That hurt someone. The middle way can accept that message without accepting the cruelty attached to it. It's like removing a note from a hateful envelope. You keep the note, you throw away the poison. Another piece of the middle way is recognizing that accountability is not a mood. You don't need to feel guilty to be responsible. You don't need to feel crushed to be sincere. You can take wise action even while feeling calm. This is a major shift for people who learned that pain equals seriousness. In Buddhism, calm is not indifference. Calm can be the clearest form of care because it allows you to respond rather than react. When calm is present, you can speak more honestly. You can apologize without turning it into a performance. You can make amends without needing applause or forgiveness on demand. You can accept consequences without turning them into self-hatred. This calm is not cold, it is stable warmth. It is the mind refusing to add fire to fire. The middle way also recognizes that sometimes you cannot repair the past directly. Someone may be gone, a moment may be lost, an opportunity may never return. Shame uses this to torture you forever. Indifference uses this to dismiss it. The middle way asks, what kind of person do I become now, given what I learned? It turns regret into guidance. It turns pain into a compass, not a prison. This kind of accountability is also quiet. It doesn't always announce itself. It shows up in small, consistent choices. You become more careful with words. You pause before reacting. You choose honesty sooner. You ask questions instead of assuming. You follow through. You notice the conditions that lead to old patterns and you change the conditions. This is real responsibility. It does not need self-destruction to prove itself. And when you slip again, because humans do, the middle way responds differently. Shame says, you're hopeless. Indifference says, who cares? The middle way says, there it is again. What led to it? What can be adjusted? This response is not soft in a weak way. It is strong in a clear way. It doesn't waste energy on self-hate. It uses energy to understand and act. Buddhism often talks about compassion and wisdom as two wings of a bird. Without compassion, wisdom becomes cold. Without wisdom, compassion becomes confused. Shame has neither. Indifference has neither. The middle way brings both online. Compassion says suffering is here. Wisdom says don't add more. Compassion says this matters. Wisdom says don't make it identity. As you practice this balance, a new feeling starts to appear. It may be unfamiliar at first. It is the feeling of being accountable without being afraid of yourself. It is the feeling of meeting your life without needing a whip or a wall. It is the feeling of being human with your eyes open and your heart intact. And from this place, a deeper question becomes possible. If accountability can exist without shame and care can exist without indifference, then what is actually driving all those cycles of pressure and punishment inside the mind? Why does the mind keep reaching for pain as if pain were progress. Why does suffering feel like proof that something is changing? There is a mechanism beneath it, almost like a trick the mind plays on itself, a way the brain mistakes discomfort for growth, and seeing that trick clearly changes the whole game. As the balance between shame and indifference begins to stabilize, something else becomes easier to notice. The mind no longer swings as wildly, yet there is still a pull toward discomfort. A strange urge to make things harder than they need to be. A subtle belief that if something doesn't hurt, it must not be working. This belief is rarely spoken out loud, but it quietly guides behavior. And it reveals one of the mind's most convincing illusions, the idea that pain means progress. This illusion forms early. Pain has always been associated with effort, with training, with discipline, with transformation. From school to work to relationships to spiritual practice, struggle is praised. Endurance is celebrated. Suffering is framed as proof that something meaningful is happening. So when the mind wants to change, it reaches for what it knows. It reaches for pain. Pain creates intensity. Intensity feels like movement. Movement feels like progress. The brain connects these dots quickly and confidently. When something hurts, the mind assumes it is being challenged. When it is challenged, it assumes it is growing. This assumption feels so natural that it rarely gets questioned. But Buddhism questions it very carefully. The mind does not actually measure growth by wisdom. It measures it by sensation. Pain is a strong sensation. It cuts through numbness. It creates focus. It produces urgency. All of this can feel like engagement, but engagement is not the same as understanding. A fire alarm is engaging. It does not teach you how to cook. When suffering appears, the brain releases stress chemicals. These chemicals sharpen attention in the short term. They narrow focus. They increase vigilance. In some situations, this is useful, but when used as a constant strategy for growth, it backfires. A stressed mind becomes reactive. It loses nuance. It mistakes pressure for clarity. This is how pain simulates progress without delivering it. The illusion works because pain demands attention. When you feel emotional pain, you feel busy inside. Thoughts race. Feelings surge. The mind is occupied. This busyness feels like effort, and effort feels moral. I'm not avoiding this, the mind says. I'm suffering through it. But suffering through something is not the same as learning from it. Buddhism distinguishes between awareness and agitation. Awareness is open. It sees clearly. Agitation is loud. It feels important. Pain produces agitation, not awareness. It keeps the mind spinning around the problem rather than understanding it. This spinning creates the sense that something is happening, but nothing new is being seen. Another reason pain feels like progress is that it creates a sense of seriousness. When you are hurting, you feel committed. You feel like you are taking life seriously. Calm can feel suspicious by comparison. Ease can feel like laziness. But seriousness does not equal wisdom. Buddhism teaches that wisdom is quiet. It does not need to hurt to be real. The mind also uses pain to avoid deeper uncertainty. If you are suffering, you don't have to face not knowing. Pain fills the space. It gives the mind something to hold on to, something to do. Sitting calmly with not knowing feels empty. Pain feels solid. So the mind chooses pain because it feels like ground. But that ground is unstable. Pain also creates a false sense of moral alignment. When you hurt after a mistake, it feels like justice has been served. The mind feels balanced. I did wrong, now I suffer. This balance feels like closure. But closure created by pain is temporary. The underlying pattern remains untouched. Buddhism teaches that insight, not punishment, is what ends repetition. There is also an identity component. Pain allows you to be the one who is trying, the one who is struggling, the one who is doing the work. These identities feel active and meaningful. Letting go of pain can feel like letting go of identity. the mind fears becoming empty or irrelevant. So it holds on to suffering as proof of engagement. The illusion deepens because pain can sometimes accompany real change. When habits shift, discomfort often arises. When attachments loosen, fear can appear. The mind then draws the wrong conclusion. It assumes pain caused the change, rather than noticing that pain was simply present during the process. Buddhism is careful here. It does not deny discomfort. It denies discomfort as the driver. When pain is treated as the driver, the mind begins to chase it. It adds extra suffering. It tightens unnecessarily. It creates inner pressure to feel bad as a sign of effort. This extra suffering does not speed up growth. It exhausts the mind. It reduces curiosity. It turns learning into endurance. A tired mind does not learn well. It survives. It copes. It repeats familiar strategies. This is why people can suffer for years and still feel stuck. The mind confuses endurance with evolution. Buddhism points out that without understanding, suffering only hardens patterns. It does not dissolve them. Pain also distorts time. When you are suffering, the present moment feels heavy and endless. The mind fixates. It loops. This looping feels like processing, but it is often repetition without insight. The same thoughts replay. The same conclusions resurface. Nothing new enters. Growth requires novelty. Pain reduces it. Another trick pain plays is urgency. When something hurts, the mind feels pressure to fix it immediately. This urgency narrows perspective. It pushes for quick conclusions. Buddhism teaches patience because patience allows complexity to be seen. Pain pushes the mind to simplify. Simplification feels efficient, but it often misses the truth. Pain also makes the mind self-centered, not in a selfish way, but in an absorbed way. When you are hurting, attention turns inward. This can feel like introspection, but it often blocks awareness of conditions outside the self. Buddhism emphasizes seeing causes and conditions clearly. Pain collapses focus into me and my suffering, reducing the ability to see the full picture. The brain also associates pain with meaning. Strong feelings feel meaningful. Neutral states feel empty. This is why people sometimes feel lost when suffering fades. Without pain, they don't know what they're doing. Buddhism teaches that meaning does not require intensity. Meaning can be quiet. It can be stable. It can be subtle. Pain is also addictive in a strange way, not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. The nervous system adapts to certain levels of stress. When stress drops, the body can feel restless. The mind may unconsciously recreate discomfort to return to a known state. This is not growth. It is conditioning. Another dead end of pain-based progress is that it creates fear of ease. When ease appears, the mind wonders if something is wrong. Shouldn't this hurt more? This fear blocks rest. It prevents integration. Buddhism teaches that integration happens in calm. Insight needs space to settle. Pain keeps shaking the snow globe. Pain also blocks trust. When growth is always painful, the mind learns to associate change with threat. It resists new insights. It braces. This resistance slows learning. Buddhism emphasizes trust in awareness. Trust that the mind can see clearly without being forced. There is also a subtle violence in using pain as motivation. It treats the mind like something that must be coerced. This reinforces the idea that gentleness is ineffective. Over time, this belief erodes self-trust. You stop believing that you can grow without pressure. This belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Buddhism offers a different model. Growth comes from understanding suffering, not creating it. When you see clearly how a pattern causes pain, the mind naturally lets go. No punishment required. The letting go may feel quiet, unspectacular, but it is real. This is why Buddhist insight often feels anticlimactic. There is no dramatic suffering crescendo. There is a simple seeing. This causes pain, and the grip loosens, the mind relaxes, the pattern weakens. This does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary, but it is effective. The illusion of pain-based progress also keeps people stuck in self-referential loops. Am I suffering enough? Am I working hard enough? These questions have no end. Buddhism shifts the question entirely. It asks, is this creating less suffering? That question points outward, toward reality, rather than inward toward self-measurement. Another cost of this illusion is burnout. Pain cannot be sustained forever. The mind eventually collapses or numbs out. People then swing to indifference, not because they don't care, but because they are exhausted. This swing is not freedom, it is compensation. Buddhism aims to end the swing entirely. When the mind stops using pain as proof of progress, a new kind of effort becomes possible. Effort without strain. Attention without tension. Learning without self-harm. This effort feels lighter, but it is not weak. It is precise. It responds to conditions instead of fighting them. This shift also changes how mistakes are handled. Without the need to suffer, mistakes become information. You can look at them directly. You can adjust calmly. The mind no longer needs to dramatize the event to feel like something is happening. Something actually happens because understanding is allowed. The brain resists this at first because it feels unfamiliar. Calm feels empty compared to pain. But over time, calm reveals depth. You start to notice details you missed before. Subtle triggers, early signs, small choices. This is where real progress lives. Not in suffering, but in awareness. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not a path. It is a signal, a message saying, look here. When you mistake the signal for the path, you keep suffering. When you listen to the signal and understand it, suffering decreases. That is the whole point. As this understanding settles, another realization appears. If pain is not progress, then what actually ends the inner struggle? What stops the constant resistance? What allows the mind to finally rest without fear of stagnation? The answer is not another technique. It is a stance, a radical one, the stance of no longer fighting what is already here, of ending the internal war entirely. When the mind finally sees that pain is not progress, a strange quiet appears. The constant effort eases. The pressure to suffer softens, and yet something deeper is still unresolved. The struggle may no longer feel productive, but the fighting itself hasn't fully stopped. There is still resistance, still tension, still a subtle stance of opposition toward parts of your own experience. This is where self-forgiveness enters, not as comfort, not as kindness, but as something far more radical. Self-forgiveness is often misunderstood. Many people think it means excusing behavior, lowering standards, or pretending nothing happened. Others think it is an emotional gesture, something warm and gentle that comes after enough suffering. Buddhism does not treat self-forgiveness this way. It treats it as the end of inner resistance. The moment the mind stops fighting what has already occurred, resistance is exhausting. It is the background tension you carry when you argue with reality, when you replay moments wishing they were different, when you tense against emotions that have already arisen, when you punish yourself for thoughts you didn't choose. This resistance may feel like responsibility, but it is actually war, and the war is always internal. Self-forgiveness, in this context, is not about being nice to yourself. It is about laying down weapons. It is the refusal to continue the inner conflict. Buddhism sees this as wisdom, not indulgence. Because fighting what has already happened does not undo it. It only adds suffering to suffering. The internal war takes many forms. Sometimes it is loud, filled with accusations and blame. Sometimes it is quiet, expressed as tightness, fatigue, or numbness. Sometimes it appears as endless analysis, trying to find the perfect explanation that will finally bring relief. But underneath all of these is the same movement, resistance to what is. Self-forgiveness begins when this resistance is seen clearly, not judged, not fixed, simply seen. You notice how much energy is spent arguing with the past, how much effort goes into wishing you were different, wiser, stronger, calmer, sooner. How often the mind says, "This should not have happened." Buddhism points out a simple truth. Whatever has happened has already happened. The war against that fact is optional. Stopping the war does not mean approving of harm. It means recognizing that reality does not negotiate. The past does not respond to punishment. The mind learns this slowly. At first, it fears that letting go of resistance means letting go of care. But something surprising happens when resistance ends. Care becomes clearer, more focused, less tangled in self-hatred. Self-forgiveness is radical because it removes the enemy. And for many people, the enemy has always been themselves. Without that enemy, the mind feels exposed. There is nothing to push against, nothing to blame, nothing to punish. This exposure can feel uncomfortable at first, but it is also where peace becomes possible. Buddhism teaches that suffering is created not just by pain, but by the craving for things to be different. Self-forgiveness is the release of that craving as it relates to the self. It is the acceptance that you were acting from the conditions present at the time. This is not an excuse, it is accuracy. You did not act from future wisdom you didn't yet have. You acted from what was available then. Seeing this does not erase responsibility. It places responsibility in the present. You stop trying to fix the past emotionally and start attending to the present practically. This shift is profound. It turns energy away from punishment and toward clarity. One of the deepest misunderstandings about self-forgiveness is the belief that it must feel good. Often it does not. Often it feels neutral, quiet, almost anticlimactic. There is no dramatic release, no emotional payoff, just the absence of struggle. Buddhism values this absence because it creates space. In that space, insight can settle. Stopping the internal war also means allowing emotions to exist without interrogation. When regret arises, you let it be felt without turning it into identity. When sadness appears, you allow it without asking what it says about you. When fear comes up, you notice it without needing to punish yourself for having it. This allowance is not passivity, it is non-resistance. Non-resistance does not mean doing nothing. It means not adding friction. Think of how much effort is spent bracing against experience, tensing against feelings, tightening around thoughts, rehearsing arguments with yourself. All of this effort drains the mind. When it stops, energy returns naturally. Self-forgiveness also changes how memory functions. Memories no longer arrive as attacks. They arrive as images, sensations, information. Without resistance, memories pass more easily. They no longer need to be fought. Buddhism teaches that what is not resisted loses its power to dominate. Another aspect of radical non-resistance is ending the habit of inner surveillance. Many people are constantly watching themselves, judging every thought, emotion, and reaction. This watching feels responsible, but it keeps the nervous system activated. Self-forgiveness relaxes this surveillance. It allows the mind to move without constant oversight. This does not lead to chaos. It leads to ease. When the internal war ends, the body notices first. Breathing deepens, muscles soften, sleep improves, the nervous system shifts out of defense. This is not spiritual imagination. It is physiology responding to safety. A mind that is no longer under attack allows the body to rest. Buddhism emphasizes that peace is not manufactured. It emerges when conditions allow it. Ending self-attack is one of those conditions. When you stop turning against yourself, the mind no longer has to defend itself. Clarity becomes possible. Self-forgiveness also dissolves the need to constantly explain yourself. Many people carry an internal trial, always preparing arguments for why they are not as bad as they feel, or why they deserve to be punished. When forgiveness occurs as non-resistance, this trial ends. There is no judge, no defense, no sentence, just the fact of experience arising and passing. This does not make you morally empty, it makes you responsive. When there is no war, you can actually hear feedback. You can see consequences without collapsing. You can apologize without begging. You can change without fear. These are signs of strength, not weakness. Another hidden benefit of self-forgiveness is flexibility. When you are no longer rigidly defending or attacking the self, you can adapt. You can revise views. You can admit mistakes. You can update understanding. Identity loosens. Life becomes more fluid. Buddhism often speaks of compassion as the natural response to suffering. When you stop resisting your own suffering, compassion arises naturally, not forced, not rehearsed. You see pain clearly, and the wish to reduce it follows. This includes reducing harm to yourself. Radical non-resistance also means letting go of the belief that you must resolve everything emotionally before moving on. Some things do not resolve neatly. Some regrets remain tender. Forgiveness does not erase tenderness. It simply removes the war around it. You can carry tenderness without carrying hostility toward yourself. There is also a deep humility in self-forgiveness. It acknowledges human limitation. It accepts that learning unfolds over time. It releases the fantasy that you could have been perfect if you had just tried harder. Buddhism sees this humility as wisdom because it aligns with reality. When the internal war ends, attention shifts outward. You become more present with others, less preoccupied with self-assessment, more available to listen, more capable of empathy. This is not because you became nicer. It is because the mind is no longer occupied with fighting itself. Self-forgiveness also changes the relationship with effort. Effort becomes lighter. It is no longer fueled by fear of punishment. It is guided by understanding. You do what is skillful because it reduces suffering, not because you are trying to redeem yourself. This is why Buddhism treats forgiveness as liberation. Not a moral achievement, but a release from bondage. The bondage is not the past. It is the resistance to the past. When resistance ends, the grip loosens. There may still be moments when old habits return. The mind may try to restart the war. This is not failure. It is conditioning. Each time you notice it and choose not to engage, you weaken the pattern. Non-resistance becomes more familiar. Peace deepens. As self-forgiveness settles, another subtle pattern becomes visible. Even without open self-attack, the mind may still replay the past, not to punish, but to remind, to keep watch, to stay alert. Memory itself can become a weapon. The mind uses it to maintain vigilance, to ensure mistakes are never repeated. This vigilance feels responsible, but it can quietly become another form of self-punishment. And understanding this requires looking closely at how the mind uses memory itself. When the inner war finally quiets and self-forgiveness begins to feel real, the mind often finds a subtler way to keep tension alive. There is no longer loud self-attack, no dramatic punishment, just a quiet replay. A moment from the past surfaces again, and again, and again. Not to learn, not to repair, but to watch, to remind, to keep guard. This is where memory stops being a teacher and becomes a weapon. Memory itself is not the problem. In Buddhism, memory is simply a function of mind, a record of experience. It allows learning. It helps you recognize patterns. It supports wisdom when used correctly. But when memory is fused with fear, it changes purpose. It stops serving understanding and starts serving control. The mind begins to replay past mistakes, not to gain insight, but to maintain vigilance. And vigilance easily turns into punishment. This replay often feels responsible. The mind tells itself, I can't forget this. I have to remember so it doesn't happen again. If I stay aware of this pain, I'll stay safe. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, but look closer. Is the replay actually producing new understanding? Or is it repeating the same emotional charge with no new information? Buddhism draws a sharp distinction here. Repetition without insight is not learning, it is suffering on loop. The mind is especially good at turning memory into a story, not just what happened, but what it means. This proves something about me. This explains why I struggle. This is why I don't deserve ease. Each replay strengthens the story. Over time, the story becomes more real than the original event. Details blur, but the emotional weight increases. Memory becomes less about facts and more about identity maintenance. This is how memory becomes an unconscious act of self-punishment. Each replay reactivates the same shame, fear, or regret. The body responds as if the event is happening again. Muscles tense, breath shortens. The nervous system goes on alert. Even though nothing is happening now, the mind keeps creating a present threat. Buddhism would say suffering is being created in real time, even though the cause belongs to the past.
One reason this habit is so hard to see is that it disguises itself as responsibility. The mind believes that letting go of the replay means forgetting the lesson. It fears that releasing memory means repeating harm. But this fear confuses memory with wisdom. Wisdom does not require constant replay. Wisdom integrates. Once a lesson is understood, it becomes part of perception. You don't need to relive the pain to remember not to touch fire. Replaying memory is also a way to avoid uncertainty. The past is known, the future is not. By staying focused on what already happened, the mind avoids the discomfort of not knowing what will happen next. This is subtle but powerful. The mind prefers familiar pain to unfamiliar openness. So it returns to memory again and again, using it as an anchor, but that anchor keeps you from moving. Buddhism teaches that the present moment is the only place where freedom exists. When memory dominates attention, the present becomes thin. You may be physically here, but mentally elsewhere. This weakens your ability to respond wisely now. Ironically, the attempt to prevent future mistakes by replaying the past actually reduces presence, which increases the likelihood of acting on habit rather than awareness. Memory as punishment also keeps the sense of self tightly bound. Each replay reinforces the one who did that. Even if you are no longer attacking yourself directly, the identity remains active. The mind says, "Don't forget who you are." This identity feels protective, but it limits growth. Buddhism emphasizes impermanence. Identity formed around memory denies change. Another aspect of this pattern is how memory loops feel urgent. Thoughts arise quickly without invitation. They interrupt calm moments. They appear during rest, meditation, or silence. This can feel frustrating. You may think you're failing at peace, but Buddhism explains that these loops are habit energy. The mind has practiced replay for a long time. It doesn't stop instantly when understanding begins. Seeing the habit clearly is already part of release. The problem is not the memory itself, but the narrative built around it. The mind doesn't just remember an action, it adds judgment, prediction, and fear. This is who I am. This will happen again. I must stay alert forever. This narrative gives memory emotional charge. Without the narrative, memory is just an image, a sensation, a fact. Buddhism trains the mind to separate memory from story. Narrative loops are especially powerful because they feel meaningful. They feel like thinking deeply. But depth is not measured by repetition. A mind stuck in narrative often misses what is actually happening now. Buddhism encourages direct awareness of present experience rather than mental storytelling. This does not mean suppressing thought. It means not believing every story thought tells. Another reason memory becomes a weapon is that it feels safer than forgiveness. Forgiveness feels final. It feels like closing a door. Memory replay feels like keeping watch. The mind fears that if it stops watching, something bad will slip through. But constant watching is not the same as awareness. Awareness is relaxed. Watching is tense. Buddhism teaches that relaxed awareness is more sensitive than tense vigilance. Memory replay also creates emotional fatigue. Each loop consumes energy. Over time, this leads to a background exhaustion that many people mistake for depression or burnout. The mind is tired because it has been carrying the same weight again and again. Letting go of the loop frees energy, not because you forgot, but because you stopped reliving.
The Buddhist practice of releasing narrative loops does not involve force. You cannot push memory away. That creates more resistance. Instead, the practice begins with recognition. You notice when the mind has shifted from present awareness into replay. You don't judge it. You don't analyze it. You simply recognize this is remembering. That recognition already loosens the grip. Next comes seeing the difference between memory and punishment. You ask gently, is this teaching me something new? Is this helping me act wisely now? If the answer is no, you don't need to continue. This is not avoidance, it is discernment. Buddhism values discernment because it directs energy where it is useful. Another part of releasing narrative loops is grounding attention in the body. Memory lives in thought. The body lives now. Feeling the breath, noticing contact, sensing weight and temperature brings attention back to present reality. This is not a trick. It is a way of reminding the mind where life is actually happening. Buddhism also teaches impermanence as a way to loosen memory's grip. The thought arises. It stays for a moment. It passes. You don't need to finish it. You don't need to resolve it. You let it move like a sound passing through space. This practice is simple but not easy. It requires patience. The mind may return to the loop many times. Each time you notice and release again. Over time, the loop weakens. Releasing narrative loops does not erase accountability. You still remember what matters. You still hold values. But the memory no longer attacks. It informs quietly. It becomes part of understanding rather than a source of pain. This is how Buddhism uses memory wisely, memory without clinging. Another subtle shift happens when memory is no longer weaponized. You begin to trust your present awareness more than your past fear. You realize that you don't need to relive pain to be careful. Carefulness can arise from clarity. This trust grows slowly, but it is transformative. The mind may resist this trust. It may say, if I let this go, I'll lose control. But control through memory is exhausting. Control through awareness is lighter. Buddhism always favors what reduces suffering, not what looks impressive. Memory loops also affect how you see yourself in the future. When the past dominates, the future feels predetermined. Releasing the loop reopens possibility, not fantasy, but flexibility. You are no longer locked into one storyline. New responses become possible because the mind is not busy replaying old ones. Another benefit of releasing memory as punishment is emotional honesty. When memory is no longer used to beat yourself, you can feel emotions more cleanly. Sadness is just sadness. Regret is just regret. They don't turn into global judgments. This makes emotional life simpler, not shallow. Buddhism does not ask you to forget. It asks you to stop clinging. There is a difference. Forgetting erases information. Releasing clinging frees attention. You remember what is useful and let go of what only hurts. Over time, as narrative loops dissolve, silence becomes less threatening. Quiet moments no longer get filled with replay automatically. Space opens. This space may feel unfamiliar at first. The mind may reach for something to occupy it, but if you stay, something else appears. Presence, ease, not dramatic, but real. This presence allows insight to deepen. Without the constant noise of memory, you start to see subtler patterns, how thoughts arise, how emotions shift, how reactions form and dissolve. This seeing is the foundation of liberation in Buddhism, not escape from memory, but freedom from being controlled by it. And yet, even as memory loses its power, another subtle pattern may remain. The mind may still judge itself, not for what happened, but for how harsh it has been. It may criticize its own criticism. This creates a strange loop where self-condemnation wears a new mask. To move beyond this, one more illusion must be seen clearly: the hidden pride inside extreme self-criticism. As the old memory loops begin to loosen, the mind often feels a new kind of space. The past is no longer playing on repeat as loudly. The inner room becomes quieter, and that quiet can reveal something surprising.
Even without the replay, even without obvious punishment, the mind may still hold on to a familiar posture. A posture that sounds humble on the surface, but quietly keeps the self at the center. This is where another hidden pattern shows itself, one that many people never notice because it wears the mask of morality. There is a kind of self-condemnation that feels almost right. It feels noble. It feels honest. It feels like proof that you are not arrogant, not careless, not shallow. It says, at least I'm hard on myself. It says, at least I don't let myself get away with things. It says, I hold myself to a high standard. And the strange part is, this can sound like spiritual discipline. It can even look like growth. But inside, something else is happening. Here is the emotional truth most people avoid. Extreme self-criticism can feel like a private badge of honor. Not in a loud way, in a quiet way, a hidden pride. A subtle superiority that says, I suffer more than others would, therefore I care more. Or, I judge myself harder than anyone else could, therefore I am more honest. Or, I don't forgive myself easily, therefore I am more serious. This pride is not cheerful. It is heavy. It is grim. But it is still pride, because it strengthens a special identity. Buddhism is very direct about the ego. The ego does not only survive through praise, it also survives through blame. Anything that keeps the self-image strong, anything that keeps me at the center, feeds it. The ego can wear bright clothes like pride and achievement, but it can also wear dark clothes like shame and condemnation. Both outfits serve the same purpose, keeping the story of me alive, important, and solid. This is why some people who seem humble are still deeply ego-driven. Their humility is not freedom, it is self-focus turned inward. Their mind is still revolving around the self, just in a painful direction. They are still measuring, comparing, judging, monitoring. The content is negative, but the structure is the same. Me, me, me. My flaws, my failure, my guilt, my unworthiness. It looks like self-awareness, but it can be self-obsession in disguise. The quiet pride hidden in self-condemnation often begins with a fear, the fear of being seen as bad. The mind tries to get ahead of judgment by judging itself first. It says, I will accuse myself before anyone else can. That way, the mind feels protected. It feels prepared. It feels like it is controlling the narrative. This is not peace. This is a strategy. And strategies like this can become addictive because they reduce uncertainty for a moment. If you condemn yourself first, you feel less vulnerable. If you attack yourself, other people's attacks feel less shocking. If you tell yourself you are not enough, you won't be disappointed when the world agrees. This can feel like realism, but it is often self-defense. And here is where pride sneaks in. The mind begins to believe it is smarter than everyone else because it sees the worst first. I'm not naive, it says. I know who I am. The tone is self-hating, but the position is still special. It is still a form of I know better. Another form of quiet pride is moral ownership of suffering. Some people treat their pain like evidence in a trial. They present it to themselves as proof of sincerity. Look how much I hurt, the mind says. Look how deeply I regret this. And hidden inside that is a claim. My regret is deeper than average. This claim may not be spoken, but it is felt. It creates identity, the serious one, the responsible one, the one who doesn't let themselves off the hook. Buddhism would call this clinging to an identity of being the one who is hard on themselves. This identity may feel ugly, but it still gives the ego shape. It still gives the mind a role to play. And any role, even a painful one, can feel safer than openness. This is why letting go of self-condemnation can feel like losing something important. It's not only that you fear becoming careless. You may also fear becoming ordinary, because extreme self-criticism can secretly make you feel distinct. Different from those people who are too relaxed, too forgiving, too comfortable. The condemned self becomes a separate self, and separation is exactly what ego wants.
There is also a competitive element that often goes unnoticed. Self-condemnation can become a way of staying above others while appearing below them. It can say, "I'm worse," but the subtext can be, "I'm also more aware." It can say, "I'm broken," but the subtext can be, "I see truths others avoid." This is not freedom. It is a clever mind protecting its specialness. Buddhism teaches that liberation involves letting go of specialness altogether, not becoming low, not becoming high, but stepping out of the entire ladder. Self-condemnation keeps you on the ladder. It simply places you on a lower rung and then uses that position to feel distinct. Another way self-condemnation reinforces ego is through control of self-image. When you punish yourself, you get to decide the story. You get to decide what you are. You get to decide how bad it is. That feels like control. It keeps you in charge. But true spiritual growth often requires surrendering control of self-image. It requires being willing to not know exactly who you are and to let life reveal you moment by moment. The ego hates that, so it chooses condemnation because condemnation is a fixed identity. This is why people sometimes cling to harsh self-criticism even when they know it hurts. It is predictable, it is familiar, it gives structure, it gives a sense of certainty. I am the kind of person who fails. That certainty is painful, but it's stable. Freedom, on the other hand, can feel like stepping into open space without a railing. The ego would rather suffer with a railing than be free without one. Self-condemnation can also become a form of emotional performance. Even when no one is watching, the mind performs for an inner audience. It tries to prove it is good by suffering. It tries to prove it is serious by being harsh. It tries to prove it is ethical by refusing peace. This performance keeps the mind tense because it is always trying to convince someone, sometimes a parent's voice, sometimes society, sometimes an old religious fear, sometimes an internal judge that never rests. Buddhism points out that any mind that is trying to prove itself is not at peace. Proof requires doubt. Proof requires a judge. Proof requires fear of the verdict. Peace does not need proof. Peace is what remains when the need to prove ends. There is also a painful irony. People who condemn themselves extremely can become less compassionate toward others, even if they don't want to. If your inner world is ruled by harsh judgment, that pattern can spill outward. You may become impatient when others make mistakes. You may secretly think, "If I have to suffer for my flaws, you should too." Or you may become overly tolerant in a confused way, allowing harm because you believe everyone is doomed anyway. Either way, self-condemnation shapes your view of humanity. The inner climate becomes the outer climate. Another subtle pride is the pride of toughness. I can handle pain, the mind says. I can take it. This toughness can feel strong, but it often hides fear of softness, because softness is vulnerable. Softness allows grief. Softness allows love. Softness allows uncertainty. Tough condemnation feels armored. It keeps you from being touched. That armor can be mistaken for discipline. But Buddhism would say real strength is the ability to stay open without collapsing. Extreme self-criticism also creates a kind of inner hierarchy, where the critic sits above the rest of you like a ruler. This ruler believes it has authority. It believes it knows best. It believes it must keep order. And yes, that is pride too. The pride of the inner controller. Even if the controller speaks harshly, it still believes it is necessary. It still believes the system would fall apart without it. That belief is ego at work. You can test this by asking a simple question inside. What do I fear would happen if I stopped criticizing myself? Often the answer is not ethical, it is emotional. I would feel exposed. I would feel uncertain. I would feel like I'm not trying. I would feel like I'm letting myself win. These answers reveal that the critic is not a moral guide, it is a fear manager, and the fear manager has a strange habit. It measures improvement by pain. If you hurt, you must be working. If you relax, you must be failing. This keeps you trapped because peace becomes suspicious. Calm becomes something you have to apologize for. Happiness becomes something you have to justify. And that is how ego keeps itself alive. It refuses to let the mind rest, because rest would reduce the importance of the self-story. Buddhism offers a different way. It does not ask you to replace self-condemnation with self-praise. It asks you to see the mechanism clearly. The moment you see that condemnation is also ego, something changes. Because you stop treating harshness as humility. You stop treating suffering as sincerity. You stop treating self-attack as wisdom. In Buddhist practice, one of the deepest steps is learning to observe the mind without becoming the mind. When condemnation arises, you notice it as an arising. Harsh judgment is here. You don't identify with it. You don't obey it. You don't fight it. You see it. This seeing weakens the pride inside it because pride needs identification. Pride needs you to believe, this is me. When you see it as a mental event, it loses authority. Another important step is learning to recognize the pleasure hidden in condemnation. Yes, pleasure. Not the warm kind, but the satisfaction of being right. The satisfaction of having a conclusion. The satisfaction of being the judge who knows the truth. Condemnation can feel like certainty, and certainty can feel good, even when it is painful. Buddhism asks you to be honest about that. Not to shame yourself for it, but to see it. Because once you see the satisfaction, you understand why the habit continues. This is also why people sometimes resist gentle teachings. Gentle teachings threaten the identity built on harshness. If you have lived as the one who must suffer to be good, then a path that says release is allowed can feel almost offensive. It can feel too easy. It can feel unearned. It can feel like a trick. That reaction is not proof that teaching is wrong. It is proof that the ego is losing its favorite tool. Buddhism does not tell you to become permissive. It tells you to become clear. Clarity does not need harshness. In fact, harshness often blocks clarity by making the mind defensive. When you stop condemning yourself, you don't become blind. You become more accurate. You can see what happened without turning it into a global sentence about your worth. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings. Many people think self-condemnation is honesty, but honesty is factual. Condemnation is interpretive. Honesty says, I spoke sharply. Condemnation says, I am cruel. Honesty says, I avoided the conversation. Condemnation says, I am a coward. Honesty points to behavior that can change. Condemnation creates identity that feels fixed. Buddhism favors honesty because it leads to skillful action. It rejects condemnation because it leads to stuckness. There is also a deep relief in dropping the need to be the worst. Some people condemn themselves so hard that they secretly believe no one has failed like they have. My mistake is unforgivable. My flaw is unique. This can feel like despair, but it can also be ego. It makes the self special in its darkness. Buddhism gently returns you to reality. You are human. Humans make mistakes. Humans learn. Humans change. You do not need to be the hero of your own tragedy. Another form of pride in self-condemnation is refusing help. Sometimes harsh self-criticism becomes a wall. If you condemn yourself first, you don't have to receive compassion from others. Receiving compassion can feel too vulnerable. It can feel like you owe something. It can feel like exposure. So the mind chooses condemnation because it keeps distance. But Buddhism teaches interdependence. We heal through connection. When self-condemnation blocks connection, it blocks healing. So what replaces condemnation when it is seen clearly? Not praise, not denial, not indifference. What replaces it is a simpler inner relationship, respect for reality. You respect cause and effect. You respect the impact of actions. You respect the truth of feelings, and you respect the mind enough not to abuse it. That respect is not dramatic, it is steady. In practice, this means when you notice the inner critic speaking in extreme terms, you don't argue with it point by point. You don't try to win. You simply stop granting it moral authority. You treat it like weather, a storm passing through. You may still take responsibility for what needs change, but you refuse the extra layer of identity-building condemnation. That refusal is humility, real humility, because it refuses to make the self the main character, even as a villain. Buddhism often points out that the goal is not to create a perfect self. The goal is to see through the illusion of a fixed self. Condemnation keeps the fixed self strong. It says, "This is me." Seeing condemnation as ego loosens that claim. You begin to experience thoughts and feelings as conditions arising and passing, not as a permanent identity. This is not abstract, it is felt. It feels like space. And in that space, you begin to recognize something. The harshest voice inside has been claiming to protect you, but it has also been protecting itself, protecting its role as the controller, the judge, the one who knows. When you stop believing it, you don't collapse. You become calmer, more honest, more able to learn. The fear that you would become careless turns out to be a story. The mind can care without cruelty. The heart can be responsible without punishment. This is the maturity Buddhism points toward. As this hidden pride is seen and the grip of condemnation loosens, a new vulnerability appears. Without the harsh voice, you may feel softer, more open, and that softness can feel unsafe at first, because it threatens the old identity built on struggle. The mind may try to return to harshness because harshness feels safer than compassion. This is the next challenge. Seeing why kindness can feel dangerous when you have lived under control for so long. As the harsh inner judge begins to lose its authority, a strange reaction often appears. The mind does not always feel relieved. Sometimes it feels exposed, softer, less armored. And in that softness, an old instinct rises up quickly and says, "This isn't safe." That instinct is why so many people return to harshness even after seeing through it. Not because harshness is wise, but because it feels safer than compassion. Harshness feels solid. It creates edges. It draws lines. It gives the mind something firm to lean against. Compassion, on the other hand, feels open. It doesn't grip. It doesn't threaten. It allows. And for a mind that has survived by control and struggle, allowance feels dangerous. Compassion threatens the identity that was built to survive pain. Many people learned early that softness led to harm. That vulnerability led to disappointment. That kindness was taken advantage of. Over time, the mind learned to protect itself by tightening, by becoming sharp, by staying alert. Harshness became a shield. It may have hurt, but it also kept the world at a distance. Compassion threatens to lower that shield. This is why compassion can feel irresponsible at first. The mind equates kindness with weakness. It says, if I stop being hard on myself, I'll lose discipline. If I soften, I'll repeat the same mistakes. If I let myself feel okay, I'll stop trying. These fears are not logical conclusions. They are survival memories. The mind is remembering how it stayed alive, not how it grows. An identity built on struggle relies on pressure to function. It knows who it is when it's fighting, when it's pushing, when it's fixing. Compassion removes the familiar friction, and without friction, the mind doesn't know who it is anymore. This loss of identity can feel more threatening than pain. Pain is familiar, emptiness is not. Harshness also provides a sense of control. When you are hard on yourself, you feel like you are managing risk. You are monitoring behavior. You are enforcing rules. Compassion loosens that control. It trusts awareness instead of force. And trust feels risky when you've learned that the world punishes mistakes harshly. Buddhism points out that control is often confused with care. But care does not require domination. Care requires presence. Harshness keeps you busy controlling outcomes. Compassion keeps you attentive to causes. One tightens the mind. The other opens it. But opening feels unsafe when your identity depends on vigilance. Another reason harshness feels safer is that it reduces emotional range. Harshness numbs. It flattens feeling. It limits how deeply joy, grief, or love can be felt. Compassion does the opposite. It increases sensitivity. It allows emotions to move freely. For a mind that associates feeling with overwhelm, this sensitivity can feel like danger. Compassion also threatens the story that suffering is necessary. Many people believe, often unconsciously, that pain is the price of being good, that ease must be justified, that rest must be earned. Compassion undermines this moral economy. It says you are allowed to stop, and stopping can feel like stepping into moral uncertainty. Harshness feels safer because it is predictable. You know what comes next: judgment, pressure, correction. Compassion is unpredictable. You don't know how you'll respond without the whip. You don't know what will motivate you. You don't know if you'll still care. The mind prefers predictable suffering to unpredictable freedom. There is also fear of grief. Compassion opens the door to feeling the full weight of what has happened. Harshness keeps grief at bay by staying busy with blame. Compassion says, let this be felt. And feeling can be terrifying if you've spent years avoiding it. The mind chooses harshness not because it's strong, but because it avoids tenderness. Another layer is trust. Compassion requires trusting that awareness itself can guide behavior, that you don't need to threaten yourself into being ethical. This trust challenges deep conditioning. Many people were taught that without punishment, there is chaos. Buddhism challenges this by pointing to clarity as a stronger guide than fear. Harshness also maintains distance from others. If you are harsh with yourself, you may unconsciously expect harshness from the world. This expectation creates emotional walls. Compassion softens those walls. It invites connection, and connection carries risk. You could be misunderstood. You could be hurt. Harshness feels safer because it keeps you alone but protected. There is also a fear of losing moral authority. If you stop condemning yourself, you may fear you lose the right to condemn certain behaviors internally. The mind worries that compassion will blur boundaries. Buddhism clarifies that compassion and discernment are not opposites. You can be kind without being confused, but this clarity takes time to trust. Compassion threatens the identity built on struggle because struggle gives meaning. When life has been organized around effort and endurance, ease feels empty. The mind asks, if I'm not struggling, what am I doing? Buddhism answers, you are living. But living without struggle can feel unfamiliar and therefore unsafe. Harshness also protects against disappointment. If you expect the worst from yourself, you won't be surprised when things go wrong. Compassion introduces hope, and hope introduces vulnerability. The mind often chooses harsh realism over tender hope because hope can break your heart. Another reason compassion feels unsafe is that it dissolves hierarchy. Harshness creates a clear top and bottom inside, the judge and the judged. Compassion removes this structure. Everything becomes more equal, more fluid. For a mind that relies on internal hierarchy to feel organized, this can feel like chaos. Buddhism teaches that safety does not come from control, but from understanding. Compassion is not blind. It sees suffering clearly and responds without violence. But the mind must unlearn the belief that pain equals seriousness. This unlearning can feel destabilizing at first. When compassion begins to replace harshness, you may notice resistance that feels physical. Tightness, restlessness, a pull back toward criticism. This is not failure, it is conditioning leaving the body. The nervous system learned to equate harshness with safety. It takes time to teach it otherwise. Compassion also removes the excuse to stay stuck. Harshness can justify paralysis. I'm too broken. I deserve this. Compassion removes those narratives. It quietly asks, what's possible now? That question can feel overwhelming if you've been hiding behind punishment. There is also fear of responsibility. Compassion makes responsibility clearer, not heavier. But clarity can feel confronting. Harshness blurs responsibility under shame. Compassion reveals it plainly. Some minds prefer blur because blur feels less demanding. Buddhism does not force compassion, it invites understanding. As you see that harshness has not actually kept you safe, the grip begins to loosen. You start to notice that compassion does not make you careless. It makes you attentive. You listen more closely. You notice earlier. You respond sooner. This is a different kind of safety. Over time, compassion begins to feel stable. The nervous system learns that softness does not equal danger. The mind learns that it can care without control. This learning is gradual. It happens through repeated experiences of not collapsing when harshness is absent. Compassion also changes motivation. Instead of being driven by fear of punishment, you are guided by care for well-being. This motivation is quieter but more sustainable. It does not burn out as easily. It does not require constant pressure. Harshness feels safer because it is familiar. Compassion feels risky because it is new. Buddhism reminds us that familiarity is not the same as truth. Many harmful patterns feel safe simply because they are known. Freedom often feels unsafe at first because it is unknown. As compassion becomes less threatening, a deeper insight emerges. You begin to see that harshness was never truly protecting you. It was protecting an identity built on struggle. And as that identity loosens, a new way of being becomes possible. One where learning does not require pain, where responsibility does not require self-destruction, where peace is not suspicious. This opens the door to another important distinction. If compassion can exist without control, then learning must also be possible without reopening wounds. Growth does not have to mean reliving pain. There is a way to extract wisdom without cutting yourself again. And understanding that difference is essential for the next step. As compassion begins to feel less dangerous and the grip of harshness weakens, a new question naturally rises. If pain is no longer the teacher, then how does learning actually happen? If struggle is not required, how do lessons stick? For many people, this is where confusion sets in because they have never been shown the difference between learning and reopening old wounds. The two can feel almost identical on the surface, yet one leads to freedom and the other quietly renews suffering. Learning feels clean. Re-wounding feels heavy. But when you've lived for a long time using pain as proof of growth, the signals get mixed. The mind revisits old experiences and assumes it is being responsible. It analyzes, revisits, and revisits again. It calls this reflection. But often nothing new is being understood. The same emotions flare. The same shame tightens. The same story plays. That is not learning. That is reopening a scar. Buddhism offers a very practical way to tell the difference. Learning increases clarity. Rewounding increases contraction. Learning leaves you more present. Rewounding pulls you back into the past. Learning ends with understanding. Rewounding ends with exhaustion. These differences may sound subtle, but they are felt directly in the body and mind. One of the clearest signs of learning is that it produces a sense of I see. Not a dramatic realization, but a quiet knowing. Something clicks, a pattern becomes visible, cause and effect make sense. From that understanding, behavior naturally adjusts. You don't have to force the change, you simply don't reach for the same thing anymore. Rewounding, on the other hand, produces a sense of I hurt. The pain may feel meaningful, but nothing changes. The mind leaves the experience more tense, not more informed. Rewounding often begins with good intentions. You want to understand what happened. You want to make sure it never happens again. But instead of staying with present awareness, the mind drops into the old emotional groove. The body reacts as if the event is happening now. This reaction floods the system with stress, which narrows perception. Narrow perception cannot learn well. It can only survive. Buddhism emphasizes that wisdom arises from seeing conditions clearly.
Rewounding obscures conditions by collapsing everything into pain. Learning expands the view. It asks gentle, precise questions. What was I feeling then? What beliefs were operating? What needs were unmet? What signals did I miss earlier? These questions feel curious, not accusatory. They open the mind rather than pressurize it. Another key difference is timing. Learning happens when the nervous system is calm enough to process information. Rewounding happens when the system is overwhelmed. This is why trying to learn while emotionally flooded often fails. Buddhism does not rush insight. It respects the mind's capacity. It knows that forcing reflection during distress only deepens the imprint of pain. Rewounding also tends to generalize. One event becomes evidence of everything. This always happens. I never get it right. Learning stays specific. It looks at one moment, one choice, one reaction. Specificity is crucial because it keeps the lesson workable. You can adjust one behavior. You cannot fix an identity. Another sign you are learning rather than rewounding is how the body feels afterward. Learning leaves the body softer. There may still be sadness or regret, but there is also relief, a sense of release. Rewounding leaves the body tight, jaw clenched, breath shallow, shoulders raised. These bodily signals are not distractions, they are guidance. Buddhism treats the body as part of wisdom, not an obstacle to it. Rewounding often comes with urgency. The mind pushes to resolve everything immediately. Learning allows patience. It understands that insight unfolds over time. Buddhism teaches that forcing understanding is like shaking muddy water and expecting it to clear. Stillness reveals clarity. Agitation spreads confusion. Another difference lies in motivation. Rewounding is driven by fear. Fear of repeating the past. Fear of being flawed. Fear of letting yourself off the hook. Learning is driven by care. Care for well-being. Care for reducing harm. Care for truth. Fear narrows the mind. Care steadies it. Buddhism also points out that rewounding often includes an element of self-punishment. There is a belief that if it hurts enough, it must be working. Learning does not require pain as a currency. It requires honesty, and honesty does not have to be cruel. One of the most important aspects of learning without rewounding is knowing when to stop. Rewounding has no natural end point. The mind can replay forever. Learning ends when the lesson is integrated. You feel it. You don't need to revisit it constantly. The understanding becomes part of perception, like knowing fire burns. You don't need to touch it again to remember. Buddhism encourages reflection, but it emphasizes right reflection. Right reflection looks at causes and conditions without adding blame. It asks, what led to suffering, rather than what is wrong with me? This shift alone can prevent rewounding. It moves the focus from identity to process. Another powerful tool in Buddhism is present moment awareness. Learning happens now. Even when reflecting on the past, the awareness stays grounded in the present. You notice thoughts as thoughts, feelings as feelings. You don't collapse into them. Rewounding happens when awareness is lost and the mind becomes the past. Rewounding also tends to isolate. You feel alone with your pain. Learning connects. It helps you see that patterns are human, not personal failures. This doesn't minimize responsibility. It contextualizes it. Context reduces shame. Reduced shame allows learning. There is also a difference in energy. Rewounding drains. Learning energizes. Even difficult insights can feel freeing because they remove confusion. You may feel tired after learning, but it is a clean tiredness, not the heavy fatigue of self-attack. Buddhism teaches that wisdom is cooling. It reduces heat. Rewounding increases heat. Anger, shame, anxiety all raise inner temperature. When reflection heats the mind, it is a sign that something is off. Learning cools because it resolves friction. Another important distinction is repetition. Learning does not need to repeat the emotional pain to remain effective. Once integrated, it guides behavior quietly. Rewounding repeats because nothing has been integrated. The repetition itself
is a signal that the method is not working. One reason people rewound themselves is distrust of ease. When learning feels gentle, the mind doubts it. Shouldn't this be harder? Buddhism challenges this belief. Ease does not mean superficial. Sometimes the deepest insights arrive quietly because the mind is finally still enough to hear them. Learning also respects boundaries. It does not push into trauma without support. Buddhism understands that some experiences require care, safety, and sometimes distance before insight is possible. Rewounding ignores boundaries. It dives into pain repeatedly, hoping for resolution. This often re-traumatizes rather than heals. Another sign of learning is forward movement. Not dramatic change, but subtle adjustment. You pause sooner, you notice earlier, you choose differently without forcing. Rewounding leaves you stuck, circling the same emotional territory. Buddhism also emphasizes compassion in learning, not indulgent compassion, but steady kindness toward the process. When the mind feels safe, it reveals more. When it feels threatened, it hides. Learning requires revelation. Rewounding creates concealment. Over time, as you learn to distinguish these two paths, trust grows. You begin to trust that understanding is enough, that you don't need to hurt to remember, that wisdom does not require reopening every wound. This trust changes how you approach growth. You stop equating suffering with seriousness. There is also relief in realizing that you are allowed to stop digging into pain once the lesson is clear. You don't owe suffering to the past. You don't have to keep scars open to prove sincerity. Buddhism treats unnecessary suffering as something to be abandoned, not honored. As learning replaces rewounding, the mind becomes steadier. You can look at your life without flinching. You can acknowledge harm without collapsing. You can change without punishment. This steadiness is not numbness. It is clarity, and yet, even with this clarity, another obstacle can appear. The mind may still cling to self-punishment as a way to show remorse, believing that without pain, change won't stick. This belief can block genuine repentance. It keeps you stuck in emotional beating rather than allowing true transformation. Understanding why punishment blocks change is the next step on this path. As learning begins to replace rewounding, something becomes very clear. Insight feels lighter. Understanding feels cleaner. And yet, right at this point, many people pull back. A familiar belief steps in and says, "This isn't enough." It says, "If I don't suffer more, the change won't be real." This is where self-punishment quietly returns, not as identity, not as memory, but as a supposed requirement for repentance. And this belief blocks transformation more than almost anything else. Repentance is often misunderstood. Many people think repentance means feeling bad for as long as possible. They believe the depth of remorse must match the depth of pain. If the pain fades too soon, they assume something is wrong. They worry they are avoiding responsibility. But Buddhism draws a very clear line here. Repentance is not emotional self-beating. Repentance is seeing clearly and turning away from what causes suffering. When you punish yourself emotionally, attention collapses inward. The mind becomes preoccupied with how bad you feel, how broken you are, how much you deserve to hurt. This feels serious, but it pulls energy away from the very thing repentance requires, awareness of causes and conditions. You cannot change what you cannot see clearly, and self-punishment clouds vision. Genuine repentance requires honesty. Not global honesty about your worth, but precise honesty about behavior. What happened? What led to it? What effect it had? What conditions supported it? Emotional self-punishment blurs these details. It floods the system with shame, and shame simplifies everything into one conclusion: I am wrong. That conclusion feels final, but it explains nothing. When the mind is beating itself, it is not learning. It is surviving. It is trying to manage pain, not understand patterns. Buddhism recognizes this and warns against mistaking suffering for purification. Suffering does not cleanse behavior. Understanding does. Self-punishment also creates fear. fear of making another mistake, fear of being seen, fear of honesty. And fear pushes behavior underground. When people are afraid of their own minds, they hide from themselves. They rationalize. They avoid. They repeat patterns without fully seeing them. This is why punishment often leads to repetition rather than change. True repentance requires safety. The mind must feel safe enough to look at itself without collapsing. Safety does not mean comfort. It means the absence of threat. When self-attack is present, the mind is under threat. It will not open, it will defend. And defended minds do not transform. Another way self-punishment blocks repentance is by creating emotional debt. You suffer so you feel you have paid something. Once payment is made, the mind feels temporary relief. That relief can be mistaken for resolution, but the pattern remains untouched. The emotional transaction ends, but the behavior does not truly change. Buddhism would say the root cause was never addressed. Self-punishment also shifts the goal of repentance. Instead of aiming to reduce suffering, the mind aims to feel sufficiently bad. Once that feeling is achieved, effort relaxes. This is why some people feel calmer after intense self-criticism. The punishment worked emotionally, but the calm is false. It comes from release of tension, not from clarity. Genuine repentance feels different. It feels sober, quiet, grounded. There may be regret, but it is not dramatic. There is resolve, but not panic. The mind is oriented toward the future, not stuck in the past. Self-punishment traps the mind in what was. Repentance turns the mind toward what is possible now. Buddhism teaches that transformation happens through turning away from unskillful action and turning toward skillful action. This turning cannot happen while the mind is busy attacking itself. Attack freezes movement. Turning requires mobility. Another subtle block is identity. When you punish yourself, you reinforce the identity of the one who did wrong. This identity can feel honest, but it becomes sticky. You may unconsciously act in ways that confirm it. True repentance dissolves identity. It says that action was unskillful, not this is who I am. Without dissolving identity, change remains superficial. Self-punishment also interferes with compassion, and compassion is essential for repentance, not because compassion excuses harm, but because compassion allows you to see suffering clearly. When you hate yourself, your view of suffering becomes distorted. You focus on your pain instead of the pain caused. Repentance requires attention to impact, not self-hatred. Another way self-punishment blocks change is through exhaustion. Beating yourself is tiring. Over time, the mind becomes depleted. Depleted minds seek relief, often through old habits. This is how cycles repeat. Buddhism emphasizes sustainable effort. Effort that does not burn the system. Self-punishment also creates rigidity. You lock yourself into vows driven by fear. I will never do this again. These vows feel strong, but they are brittle. When pressure rises, they snap. Genuine repentance creates flexibility. It understands that conditions change and prepares for that change. Buddhism also highlights intention. Intention shapes action. When intention is soaked in self-hatred, action is distorted. Even good actions can be tense, performative, or defensive. When intention comes from clarity, action is natural. Repentance guided by clarity produces different energy than repentance driven by punishment. There is also a misunderstanding about humility. Many people believe humility requires emotional pain. They think feeling okay means arrogance. Buddhism disagrees. Humility is seeing reality clearly. Self-punishment is not humility. It is self-centeredness turned inward. Genuine repentance is humble because it accepts limitation without drama. Another key difference lies in time. Self-punishment lives in the past. Repentance lives in the present. You cannot change the past emotionally. You can only change present causes. Every moment spent beating yourself is a moment not spent adjusting conditions now. Self-punishment also interferes with receiving feedback. When you are already attacking yourself, external feedback feels overwhelming. You may shut down or become defensive. Genuine repentance allows feedback to be received and integrated. It does not need to protect a fragile self-image. Buddhism also teaches that suffering itself is not the goal. Reducing suffering is. When repentance increases suffering without reducing harm, it misses its purpose. Self-punishment often increases suffering in the mind while doing little to prevent future harm. This is why it is abandoned on the path. Another subtle trap is moral pride. Punishing yourself can feel like taking the high road. It can feel like proof of seriousness. But seriousness does not require cruelty. Repentance guided by wisdom is quiet, not theatrical. True repentance also includes forgiveness, but not as comfort, as release. You release the self from being the battlefield so that energy can move toward change. Without forgiveness, repentance becomes endless. With forgiveness, repentance becomes effective. Buddhism emphasizes that change happens when insight meets intention. Self-punishment blocks insight. It narrows focus. It reduces curiosity. It makes the mind brittle. Insight requires openness. Repentance requires insight. When emotional beating stops, repentance actually deepens. You become more aware of subtle triggers. You notice earlier signs. You respond sooner. This is real change. It does not look dramatic, but it is stable. There is also a deep relief in realizing that you do not need to suffer to prove sincerity. You can be sincere and calm at the same time. You can care deeply without bleeding internally. Buddhism calls this wisdom. As self-punishment loosens, the mind begins to trust itself more, not because it is perfect, but because it can see clearly. This trust supports ethical living far more than fear ever could. And yet, as this trust grows, another fear may appear, a fear that peace itself is dangerous, that calm feels undeserved, that after long suffering, ease feels suspicious. This fear can quietly pull people back into pain. Understanding why peace itself can feel threatening after long struggle is the next turning point on this path. As self-punishment loosens and repentance becomes clearer, something unexpected often happens. The mind does not immediately relax into relief. Instead, a quiet unease appears. Calm arrives, and rather than feeling safe, it feels wrong, almost suspicious, as if something important has been forgotten, as if danger is being ignored. This is a moment many people don't talk about, but it shapes everything that comes next. The fear of peace after long suffering. For a mind conditioned by pain, peace is unfamiliar territory. Suffering has been the landscape for so long that it feels normal, even honest. Pain became a language. Struggle became structure. Effort became identity. When calm finally appears, the mind doesn't know how to live there. It has no map, and without a map it assumes the place must be unsafe. This fear does not come from logic. It comes from conditioning. The nervous system learns through repetition. If you spent years under pressure, criticism, or emotional threat, your body adapted. It learned to stay alert, to scan for danger, to brace. Over time, that state became home. Peace, by contrast, feels empty, quiet, exposed. The body asks, "Why am I not preparing for something?" The mind asks, "What am I missing?" Many people secretly believe that peace must be earned through suffering, that calm without pain is dishonest, that ease without punishment is immoral. These beliefs are rarely examined because they feel serious. They sound responsible, but Buddhism asks a simple question. If suffering were the price of peace, why does suffering so often lead to more suffering instead of wisdom? Long suffering creates familiarity, not truth. When you live under pain for a long time, pain becomes proof of engagement. It tells you that you are trying, that you care, that you haven't given up. Peace removes that proof, and without it, the mind feels unanchored. It worries that calm means laziness, that relief means avoidance, that rest means failure. There is also guilt tied to peace, a subtle guilt. How can I feel okay when so much went wrong? How can I rest when others are still suffering? How can I be calm when I haven't fully paid? This guilt makes peace feel undeserved. Buddhism does not deny moral sensitivity, but it challenges the idea that inner suffering helps anyone. Carrying pain does not fix the past. It only multiplies pain in the present. Another reason peace feels dangerous is that suffering often kept you vigilant. Vigilance feels protective. Calm feels like lowering your guard. For a mind trained by hardship, lowering the guard feels reckless. If I relax, the mind says, something bad will happen. This belief is not a thought, it is a bodily memory. The body remembers times when relaxation led to harm, so it resists calm automatically. This is why people sometimes sabotage peaceful moments. Right when things settle, the mind picks a fight. It reopens old regrets. It worries about the future. It criticizes something small. Not because it wants pain, but because pain feels safer than uncertainty. Suffering gives the illusion of control. Peace requires trust. Peace also threatens identity. If you have lived as the one who struggles, the one who survives, the one who carries weight, then peace asks a frightening question. Who are you without that role? The mind may cling to suffering because it provides meaning. Without it, there is a blank space. Buddhism teaches that this blank space is not emptiness in a negative sense. It is openness. But openness can feel terrifying when you are used to being defined by struggle. Another hidden fear is that peace will make you forget. Forget the lessons, forget the harm, forget what matters. This fear assumes that pain is the only way memory stays alive. Buddhism disagrees. Wisdom remembers without reopening wounds. Calm does not erase understanding. It allows understanding to function without distortion. Peace can also feel lonely at first. Suffering often creates connection through shared pain, through stories of struggle, through mutual survival. When you step into calm, you may feel separate, different, as if you've left something behind. This can create grief. Grief for the old identity. Grief for the familiarity of pain. Buddhism recognizes this grief as part of letting go. There is also a fear of disappointment. When peace arrives, the mind worries it won't last, and if it doesn't last, the fall will hurt. So the mind stays guarded. It keeps one foot in suffering as a backup. Don't get too comfortable, it says. This won't last. This protective pessimism feels wise, but it prevents full presence. You never fully arrive. Another layer is moral fear. Some people believe that being calm means not taking life seriously, that urgency equals care, that without inner pressure, values will fade. Buddhism offers a different view. Values rooted in fear collapse under stress. Values rooted in clarity endure. Peace also changes how responsibility feels. When you are suffering, responsibility feels heavy and dramatic. When you are calm, responsibility becomes quieter, more ordinary. This ordinariness can feel insufficient. Shouldn't this feel heavier, the mind asks. Buddhism says no. True responsibility is often simple. You see what reduces harm and you do it. The fear of peace can also show up as restlessness. When calm appears, the mind looks for stimulation, noise, problems, tasks, anything to avoid stillness. This restlessness is not a flaw. It is the nervous system adjusting to a new baseline. Buddhism treats this gently. It does not force stillness. It allows restlessness to settle gradually. Another reason peace feels undeserved is comparison. You look at others and think, they've suffered more, or they haven't forgiven me, or I haven't fixed everything yet. Peace becomes conditional on external validation. Buddhism points out that inner states are not awarded by others. Peace is not a verdict. It is a condition that arises when causes allow it. Long suffering also trains the mind to equate intensity with truth. Calm feels flat by comparison. It can feel boring, empty, even meaningless. But this is a misreading. Calm is not the absence of meaning. It is the absence of noise. When the noise fades, subtler meanings appear, but the mind must slow down enough to notice them. Another fear is vulnerability. Peace opens the heart. When you are calm, you are more available to feel joy, love, and connection, and these feelings carry risk. You can lose them, you can be hurt. Suffering keeps the heart guarded. Peace opens it. Opening feels dangerous when you've been hurt before. Buddhism does not force peace. It understands that peace must feel safe before it can settle. Safety comes from repeated experiences of calm, without catastrophe. Over time, the nervous system learns that nothing terrible happens when you rest. This learning cannot be rushed. It must be lived. Peace also removes excuses. When suffering dominates, you can explain inaction through pain. When calm appears, you see more clearly what is possible. This clarity can feel confronting. It removes hiding places. Some minds prefer suffering because it justifies staying stuck. There is also a subtle loyalty to pain. Pain may feel like honoring what happened. Letting go can feel like betrayal. Buddhism reframes this. Honoring the past does not require living in it. Learning honors the past. Repetition does not. Another fear is that peace will expose unresolved emotions. Ironically, peace can allow deeper feelings to surface. Grief that was buried under struggle. Sadness that was masked by anger. This can make peace feel like a threat. Buddhism welcomes these feelings. It sees peace not as numbness, but as the ground where emotions can finally move. Peace also challenges the belief that you must be fixed to be okay. It says you can be okay while still changing. This idea can feel radical to a mind trained in self-improvement through pain. But Buddhism insists that acceptance and change are not opposites. Acceptance allows change to happen without violence. As peace becomes more familiar, its fear begins to soften. You start to notice that calm does not make you careless. It makes you clearer. You notice that you still care about others. You still act responsibly. You still learn. The only thing missing is the constant inner tension. And that tension was never wisdom. The mind slowly learns that peace is not dangerous. It is just unfamiliar. And unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means new. Over time, calm begins to feel stable, not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. And in that steadiness, life becomes more workable. But even as peace grows, the mind may still worry about accountability. It may ask, if I let go this much, am I avoiding something? This leads to another important distinction. Letting go does not mean letting yourself off the hook. Buddhism makes this distinction very carefully, and understanding it prevents peace from sliding into avoidance. As peace begins to feel less threatening, another concern quietly surfaces. The mind asks a careful question, one that sounds wise on the surface. If I let go this much, am I avoiding responsibility? This question keeps many people stuck halfway. They sense that release is necessary, but they fear it will turn into denial. They want freedom without dishonesty, lightness without escape. This is where Buddhism offers one of its most precise and misunderstood insights. Letting go is not the same as letting yourself off the hook. Most people only know two modes. One is self-punishment, where responsibility is enforced through pain. The other is avoidance, where discomfort is escaped by pretending nothing matters. Because these are the most common options, letting go is often confused with the second. Buddhism cuts directly through this confusion by redefining what responsibility actually is. Responsibility, in Buddhist understanding, is not emotional weight. It is responsiveness. It is the ability to see clearly what causes suffering and to adjust behavior accordingly. Avoidance turns away from seeing. Punishment stares at suffering without understanding it. Letting go is neither. It releases the extra suffering so that seeing becomes possible. When people fear letting themselves off the hook, they usually imagine a version of themselves becoming careless, dismissive, or morally lazy. But this image comes from a misunderstanding of how change happens. Buddhism does not rely on guilt to guide action. It relies on insight.
Insight does not disappear when guilt is released. It becomes sharper. Avoidance numbs awareness. Letting go sharpens it. This is the key distinction. If something is being avoided, awareness shrinks. If something is being released, awareness expands. The mind becomes more present, not less. More honest, not more evasive. One reason this distinction is so hard to grasp is that many people were taught that pain is the only teacher. They were not taught how to learn without fear. So when pain fades, they assume learning must be stopping. Buddhism challenges this directly. It says that fear-based learning is unstable. It works only as long as fear is present. Insight-based learning remains even when fear dissolves. Letting go does not erase consequences. Consequences still unfold. Actions still matter. What changes is the relationship to those consequences. Instead of meeting them with self-hatred, you meet them with clarity. You don't argue with reality. You respond to it. Avoidance tries to erase consequences emotionally. Letting go allows consequences to be felt without resistance. This is an important difference. When you avoid, you distract yourself. When you let go, you stay present. Presence is not avoidance. Presence is courage without drama. Buddhism also separates intention from outcome. You may let go of self-punishment while still taking corrective action. You may forgive yourself while still making amends. You may release guilt while still changing behavior. None of these cancel each other out. In fact, they support each other. Avoidance says, "This didn't matter." Letting go says, "This mattered, and I don't need to destroy myself to acknowledge that." One denies reality. The other respects it. Another reason people fear letting go is that they confuse emotional intensity with sincerity. They believe that if they no longer feel bad, they must no longer care. Buddhism dismantles this belief gently. Care is not measured by pain. Care is measured by attention and action. You can care deeply and feel calm. You can take responsibility without suffering. This may feel unfamiliar, but unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means you are leaving an old conditioning. Letting go also changes how memory works. Avoidance suppresses memory. Letting go integrates it. You remember without reliving. You know without reopening. This integration allows memory to guide behavior quietly instead of attacking from behind. Another distinction is timing. Avoidance rushes past discomfort before understanding occurs. Letting go comes after understanding. Buddhism emphasizes right timing. You don't let go prematurely. You let go when clinging is no longer useful. Clinging to guilt after a lesson has been learned is not responsibility. It is habit. Letting go at that point is not avoidance. It is accuracy. Buddhism also emphasizes that release is not something you do once. It is something you practice moment by moment. Each time the mind tightens, you notice. Each time it tries to punish, you pause. You don't push the feeling away. You don't indulge it. You allow it to pass. This is not avoidance. It is skill. Avoidance seeks comfort. Letting go allows discomfort without adding extra suffering. This is why letting go can sometimes feel uncomfortable at first. You are no longer numbing or attacking. You are simply present. Another important marker is behavior over time. Avoidance leads to repetition. Letting go leads to change, not because of force, but because insight remains available. When the mind is not busy punishing itself, it can notice earlier signals. It can adjust sooner. It can choose differently. Buddhism also speaks of ethical restraint, not as suppression, but as alignment with understanding. When you see clearly that certain actions cause suffering, restraint arises naturally. You don't need to scare yourself into it. You don't need to threaten yourself. You simply don't reach for what you see causes harm. This restraint feels lighter than self-control. It does not feel like holding your breath. It feels like clarity guiding movement. Another fear around letting go is losing motivation. Many people believe they are only motivated by pressure, but pressure-driven motivation burns out. When you let go of punishment, a different motivation appears. Care for well-being, care for truth, care for reducing harm.
This motivation is quieter, but it lasts. Avoidance avoids truth. Letting go aligns with truth. This alignment is what gives Buddhism its confidence in release. You are not escaping reality. You are finally meeting it without distortion. Letting go also requires trust. Trust in awareness. Trust in learning. Trust that you don't need to suffer to stay ethical. This trust grows through experience. Each time you respond wisely, without self-punishment, the trust strengthens. There is also a humility in letting go. It accepts that you cannot change the past emotionally. It stops pretending that inner suffering repairs outer harm. It focuses on what can actually be done now. This humility is not self-dismissal. It is realism. Avoidance often comes with defensiveness. Letting go comes with openness. You become more receptive to feedback, more willing to admit mistakes, less invested in protecting an image. This openness is the opposite of avoidance. Another way to tell the difference is how you relate to others. Avoidance isolates. Letting go reconnects. When you are no longer wrapped up in self-punishment, you can be more present with people. You listen better, you respond with less reactivity. This is not moral collapse. It is moral maturation. Buddhism also teaches that suffering is not proof of virtue. Reducing suffering is. When letting go reduces suffering without increasing harm, it is skillful. When avoidance reduces discomfort by ignoring harm, it is unskillful. The result matters. Over time, letting go builds stability. You no longer swing between extremes. You don't need to whip yourself or hide from yourself. You stand in the middle, aware and responsive. This is the middle way in action. This understanding also softens the fear of peace. Peace no longer feels like cheating. It feels like clarity functioning without interference. You begin to trust calm as a sign of alignment, not avoidance. And yet, as this balance becomes more familiar, another confusion can arise. The mind may still equate heaviness with responsibility. It may still believe that if things feel light, something must be missing. This leads to another misunderstanding, the belief that responsibility should feel heavy. Buddhism offers a very different perspective. One that shows responsibility, when done correctly, actually feels lighter, not heavier. You've walked through something most people never stop to question. You've seen how punishment disguises itself as responsibility, how guilt pretends to be wisdom, how suffering masquerades as growth. And through every layer, one truth keeps returning, quieter each time but stronger than before. You cannot punish yourself into becoming peaceful. Peace was never hiding at the end of your pain. It was buried under it. Under the inner wars, the replayed memories, the harsh judgments, the belief that hurting meant you were trying. What Buddhism shows again and again is that freedom begins the moment you stop fighting yourself and start seeing clearly. Self-forgiveness is not weakness. It is not forgetting. It is not letting yourself off the hook. It is the end of inner violence, and it is responsibility without cruelty. It is learning without reopening wounds. It is peace uncovered, not earned. If something in this teaching shifted you, even slightly, pause for a moment and let it land. Then, write one sentence in the comments. What are you finally ready to stop punishing yourself for? You may be surprised who else needs to read your words. And if this kind of depth, clarity, and quiet truth matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Not for noise, not for motivation, but for understanding that actually changes how you live. You don't have to suffer to be sincere. You don't have to hurt to grow. You don't have to fight to be free. Thank you for being here, and when you're ready, rest.